Nothing to do but to do it, right? Um, I guess we'll start. So I've actually tried to begin this essay so many times. I've been talking about this for I don't know, like 2 years now. And then I wrote it and I rewrote it and I started recording it and I stopped recording it and I've entirely revamped it and destroyed it and given up on it and fucking raised it to heights unknown. And now I'm just gonna go for it. We've got bad lighting and subpar audio, and I'm just going to talk about Dark Souls because I want to talk about Dark Souls. So, Dark Souls is a very personal game for me. I've probably thought more about its lore and its world than any other piece of media I've ever consumed. With like the one possibility being the Digimon movie when I was really young, but that's a whole like other video essay. But like Dark Souls has frustrated me and it's moved me and it's given me some of the best experiences that I've ever had in a lifetime of playing games. And it's also been like my comfort food whenever things have been really, really tough. It's this place that I return to whenever the world feels like it's too much to handle. And I know I'm not alone in this. Like, this is definitely not the first Dark Souls saved my life essay out there. I wondered for years what it was about this game that was so compelling to me. What kept pulling me back into this like dreary, obtuse world, and why did I feel like I was getting so much out of it? And here's the reason I came to. Drink some wine, make it easy. Thesis. Dark Souls is a dense phenomenological meditation on the human psychological journey, married and in opposition to the accelerating implosion of the dominant cultural myth in the twilight of our gods. Dark Souls is about depression. I literally wrote B-roll or something. So, Dark Souls is a game that's been talked about and analyzed and politicized and theorized and lored through and broken by so many people for so many years that basically its own cottage industry on YouTube. Like there are entire channels here that exist exclusively on a diet of like digging through the game files or discussing the architectural connections between Honor Londo and Lost Izalith. So logically, the FromSoft discourse party is kind of a saturated market. And really everything that I'm going to say here is probably been better said by somebody else. Really, I'm just kind of hurling a small droplet into a vast sea. And, fair point. But it's also true that Dark Souls has occupied this huge place in my life for like a decade now. I have filled myself with lore videos and strategy guides and mellow-voiced Let's Plays to a ridiculous degree, and I keep coming back to it. It's also been my go-to game anytime I feel like I can't really get a hold of my own mind. It's the text that, like, whenever I feel kind of chaotic and lost, I return to again and again, and I take comfort in it. I've played through fully or partially countless times, and it now comfortably occupies this central role in my centering ritual. There's just something about the world and the gameplay and the weird mythological alchemy that just grounds me in a way that nothing else really can. And I've been as fascinated by that reaction in myself as I have been by the game itself. You know, on the surface, it doesn't make a lot of sense that a game that's known for its aggressive difficulty and borderline indecipherable narrative would become this kind of comfort blanket for me. So I'm going to talk about it. Because it turns out there are no rules, and life is fleeting, and because maybe Campbell was right, I don't know. Live your quiet parts loud or something. I think the traditional way to do a video essay like this is to walk you through the basic plot, sum up my thoughts at the end, and intersperse them throughout as the mood takes me. However, as I think just the entire collected works of Vatavidya can attest, I can't really take that approach with Dark Souls. This isn't a game about like neat and tidy lines or narratives, so I'm not even going to try to talk about it in a linear way. Instead, I have decided to break my thoughts into a few distinct parts and to ramble wildly about in each topic until I run out of steam or I find myself doubling back too many times. I will not be dissuaded from this path. Still, I want somebody who only has a cursory knowledge of Dark Souls to be able to at least get the gist of what I'm saying. And none of this is going to make a whole lot of sense without at least a little background knowledge. So we're going to start at the beginning. We're going to begin where the game begins. And it opens with a creation myth. Part the first. The dawn of consciousness.
In the age of ancients, the world was unformed, shrouded by fog. A land of grey crags, arch trees, and everlasting dragons. But then there was fire. And with fire came disparity. Heat and cold, life and death, and of course, light and dark. Then from the dark they came and found the souls of lords within the flame. Nito, the first of the dead. The Witch of Izalith and her daughters of Chaos. Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, and his faithful knights. And the furtive pygmy, so easily forgotten. With the strength of lords, they challenged the dragons. Gwyn's mighty bolts peeled apart their stone skills. The witches weaved great firestorms, But soon the flames will fade, and only dark will remain. Even now, there are only embers, and man sees not light, but only endless nights. And amongst the living are seen carriers of the accursed dark side.
Got to start scholarly. So we're going to talk about myth and my guy C.G. Jung. Now, I'm a huge fan of Jung and his band of merry heresies. Honestly, he would be like an entire course unto himself. So we're just going to skip to the relevant parts here. And so for my money, probably the best primer into Jung's ideas on like archetypes and myth was actually written by a student of his, a guy named Erich Neumann. Pretty sure I pronounced that right. So in the book, The Origins and Histories of Consciousness, Erich makes the case that in the development of myth across time, we can kind of see the story of consciousness played out in miniature. The one great story is both roughly a historical account of what conscious development looked like for the species, as well as a kind of prophetic utterance of how each individual will experience that same process in themselves. If consciousness in its full bloom is this specific, well-organized thing that I'm doing now, then it didn't just arise fully formed out of a cloud one day. It had to emerge out of a series of successively less specific and less well-organized states. The universe is fractal. Flying is just falling with style. It takes a lot of pencils to draw your first perfect circle. Pick your metaphor. All right, fair enough. Second, evolution, in this case, both a biological and a psychic evolution, is an iterative process. So it builds on what has already been made. Older modes of being form the bedrock for our newer, flashier functions. Our bodies evolved, as did our psyches, and so it stands to reason that our ability to, do geometry or write poetry or replay that argument you had in your head with your boss, but this time you're really smart and cool, that this ability is a creative use or a small step away from a bunch of much older and more primitive functions and structures. Third, because of our social nature, ability to form lasting memories, and our ability to communicate, we've passed stories of ourselves and important information from one generation to the next. These records of life and experience have likewise accumulated. We have experiences and we watch each other live in the world, and we talk about those things with each other and remember those stories. Over time, we form a kind of complex consensus about what the important stories are. And because of the second bit about evolution, this process itself is a kind of hologram of its own structure. Your psyche was adapted to this world, and so its shape tells you something about the kind of world that it developed in. Your own perceptions and experiences and the behaviors of the people around you also indicate something about the shape of the psyche. So the way we build myths and the way they accumulate across time have a kind of encoded truth to them. That's the idea, at least. It almost has to be somehow, because we aren't able to call forth wholly new desires and experiences from nowhere. You can talk about grief, but you didn't invent grief. It came with the package, as did linear time and the presence of other people and the ability to speak and grab things. Your consciousness arose in a context, and that feeling of grief may be intensely personal, but it was developed outside of you. It's a kind of inheritance from the long, long ago. By experiencing it and seeing others experience it, you can learn something about the kind of world that you live in. And more importantly, you can learn how to live in it That's a much more important problem if you're a person. What are the ways of reacting to that experience, and how do they tend to play out? So it's this blending and distilling of objective and subjective in the unconscious and the preconscious that gives rise to the specific characteristics and styles of myth. In his own words, then, mythological accounts of the beginning must invariably begin with the outside world, for world and psyche are still one. There is as yet no reflecting, self-conscious ego that could refer itself to anything. That is, reflect. Not only is the psyche open to the world, but is still identical with and undifferentiated from the world. It knows itself as world and in the world, and experiences its own becoming as a world becoming, its own images as the starry heavens, and its own content as the world-creating gods. Thus, the coming of consciousness manifesting itself as light in contrast to darkness of the unconscious is the real object of the creation mythology. So, put a little more plainly, given that we are a part of the natural world, there was a time in which humans weren't strictly conscious. Whether this was hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago, there was a time when our minds were undifferentiable from animals. Consciousness was something that came to us slowly and in pieces over an ambiguous period of development. You know you're conscious, whatever that actually means. Your dog seems pretty conscious. Maybe not quite at the level you are, but still kind of present. An iguana, harder to tell. Some of the pieces are there, but it also seems kind of basic in its thoughts. And by the time you get to, mosquitoes and bacteria, the discussion of consciousness is right out the window. So, in the iterative way of evolution, whatever we need by consciousness must have been built over this long succession of non-conscious or proto-conscious structures. Your ancestors were alive before they were aware. And that awareness came about slowly and in stages over a tremendous amount of time. Body first, then reaction patterns, then emotions, then imagination, then full-on abstractions, and finally, a self-contained and fully automated bag of anxious self-awareness. Existence precedes essence. Or, put in the language of myth, there was a period of time in which there was an undifferentiated nothing, which gave birth spontaneously to great forces that slowly shaped the world of structure and causation and definable qualities.
Thus began the Age of Fire.
So, in Eric's view, this is the species history, more or less. But importantly, it's also your history. Being born is mostly instinct. You climbed a long way to become the self-aware and abstract creature that you are today. Which, it seems weird, but you know this, right? Look back at your own childhood. At a certain point, things become kind of hazy and indistinct. Your ability to remember exactly what happened and when gets harder and harder until ultimately just becoming nothing, right? You know that there definitely was something there, something from which you sprang out of, but in a very real sense, there wasn't really a you there yet to experience it. At least not in the way that you think about yourself now.
The world was unformed, shrouded by fog.
So if you study developmental psychology, for example, you can see there's a whole set of discrete stages of awareness that someone goes through, basically figuring out that they exist. That there's a difference between the inside and the outside, up through theory of mind, so on and so forth. Maybe a little more articulate. This period of your life predates the solidification of episodic memory. Without that, you don't really have a causal record, and without a record, you can't have an ego as we really understand it. Instead, You're really more a loose collection of needs and desires slowly forming themselves into some kind of consensus. Babies are very impressionistic. In myth, this whole process takes on a story-like structure with particular qualities because we, as human beings, are in fact orchestrating a rather complex hallucination about reality all the time. Coming up with the idea of objectivity is actually a pretty complicated ask. You may feel anger early on, but it takes a long time for you to really distinguish the feeling from the thing that evokes it, pulling your psyche out of the environment, as it were. And it takes even more time before you can recognize a you that's actually experiencing the anger as opposed to just merely identifying with it fully. Consciousness fights this long battle into full illumination. And importantly, it's never truly divorced from all the things that came before it. It still rests on top of and is embedded in all the foundational structures that preceded it. What you are is this total experience of yourself all the time. You blend your deep subjective drives and experiences with your sense data just as a matter of course. It's why children have imaginary friends, and why you give your Roomba a name, and why you sprint up the stairs when you turn the light off and all your fears suddenly rush into the void to murder you. It's also part of the reason why you can exist at all, given that there are infinite possibilities and perspectives at all times and places relentlessly. This is not a bug. It is a feature.
Another reason we F, I think, is because it turns out that the world actually sustains relatively high-level generalizations and regularities that can only be framed in terms of these high-level concepts and categories. And these high-level concepts and categories can only be understood as being applicable because they discard much of the massively complex, fine-structured details of the world underneath them. So that which we register as a chair or as a seminar talk or as what I register as one of you or something like this, is much more detailed than my registration of you as a tutor or as a professor or as a graduate student or something like that.
This process goes on all the time. It was just more pronounced early on when your psyche was less cohesive. Or more accurately, the process is the actual underlying action of consciousness. It's what the world was like before you got really good at naming things and categorizing everything. The dream precedes reality. So, myth and stories and all of that, they're a human staple. They're inherently compelling to everyone, everywhere, forever. That's why they're still around thousands of years later, why you still go to the movies and stare at a bunch of dancing lights for 2 to 3 hours. Even if The Odyssey never really blew your hair back, you still got into, Breaking Bad or Gossip Girl or professional wrestling, right? It's inherently compelling for us as people to watch these sorts of stories play out. Myth is the world not so much as a collection of facts, but closer to how you actually experience it. A place where people have goals and try to achieve them, and explanations about the ways those attempts go, for better or worse. Looking at you, Oedipus. And that's all you've got. All you've ever really had. You just woke up one day, right in the middle of all of this, with no context or explanation. Just a bunch of needs and hates and sensations and a whole lot of things to do. Hence why the big important god in the myth tends to be something associated with light and establishing some kind of order. It's the closest we can get in trying to describe what it's like to suddenly wake up out of matter. And whole cultures coalesce around myths like this. They're the underlying ligaments of societies.
to establish social and political norms. This is a common dynamic in all world mythology. Codes, laws, defining the boundaries of acceptable human behavior. What are the social rules? What are the codes of conduct? What's moral and what's immoral? This sociological function can also bleed over into political structures, right? Some ancient societies, and you could argue this is happening right up to today, build their political systems around this cosmological and sociological function. Who are we in the cosmos?
Now, that was a whole lot, I know, but when I say that Dark Souls is about depression, I don't really mean it in the way that a research article is about depression, or that very special episode of Saved by the Bell is about depression. Dark Souls is about depression the way life can be about depression. I've got to stop saying that word back to back. Anyway, all this talk about myth is purposeful. It puts the narrative in a certain frame where the lines between subject and object, between fact and metaphor, are more like conventions than hard distinctions. And that mindset is really going to permeate the rest of this. And believe me, there is a lot of the rest of this. Check the runtime. But there's a really important point to hammer in before we move on. The myth we're given isn't a simple "let there be light" statement. Instead, we're told very explicitly that after the first flame emerged and disparity came into the world, the powers of creation manifested in 4 distinct aspects.
Life and death, and of course, light and dark.
This is really important because none of these motifs can really be understood in any kind of simple binary, like good and evil. In fact, that idea is treated really critically by the game itself. So for the sake of brevity, I'll outline how I'm going to interpret this going forward. I've decided not to include a bunch of item descriptions and in-game dialogue as support here because this video is already going to be pretty long. And I feel like I'm asking a lot as it is. So for now, just entertain the concepts. So life and death are pretty self-explanatory. One is the animating energy a living thing possesses, and the other is the state that exists when that energy is expended. A stone has no life and is thus outside of life and death in any real sense. But to have a distinct energetic existence means simultaneously that existence can and will cease. I hope this isn't a shock to anyone. Disparity creates a distinction. Things are now separate, meaning they have edges, not just in space, but in time. Hence, to be alive means you have a distinct beginning and end. Now, light, as I elaborated above, represents conscious awareness. Call it ego, or a sense of identity, or the spirit of rationality, what have you. It represents the part that can abstract, can separate from and examine. Is aware of time, can jump around between the past and the present at will, etc. There's actually some cool lore you can put together across the 3 games that equates Gwyn's power over light with power over time, which basically means that the lightning bolts that strip the dragons of their immortality were doing so by cutting them apart with the concept of time. I don't have a point about that. I just thought it was cool. The dark then represents the unconscious. It's the dim but very potent parts of us that exist outside the light of consciousness. It's where our emotions lie, our real needs and desires. It's all the bedrock out of which awareness arose. but it's also its dancing partner. Consciousness can tell you how to get what you want. It can help you understand what you want. It can mediate between wants. It can even argue why what you want isn't really what you want. But it can't itself generate desire. The unconscious is mysterious, potentially chaotic, without awareness in the sense we tend to use the word, and deeply, profoundly alive. All right, cool. So myth is just the psyche projected outward onto the world and then reinterpreted by itself. We love stories because we are stories. Light and dark are neither good, evil, nor life and death. Instead, these are the elements that make up the world we're going to be entering. These are the elements that make up the world we live in now, actually. But an important element of this whole existence thing is that you're not just a generalized cosmic phenomenon. You're not merely a puppet of forces that are older than you. You might be full of these patterns, living through the same kaleidoscope that every human has. But it is you that is living it. You are still the specific thing that has the specific choices under specific circumstances. The world is psyche, or at least you're unable to separate the two in your own experience. But you're also a distinct locus of awareness, living amidst all these old cosmic forces. You didn't get to choose your shape, or your desires, or the circumstances of your surroundings, but you're still tasked with deciding how to pursue those desires in the world as best you can. Stories have protagonists. And famously, that problem is also tackled in mythology. As outlined in, say it with me now, Joseph Campbell's seminal study of the monomyth outlined in The Hero with a Thousand Faces. That old chestnut. And look, the hero's journey motif has been gone over by just about everyone who's talked about a story on the internet, even once. So I'm not going to beat that particular horse carcass here again. If you want some descriptions with real depth, there are plenty of incredible and brilliant folks going over every aspect and iteration you could imagine. So go forth and support them. Or just go watch some Dan Harmon interviews. Like, he'll have diagrams for you. It'll be a whole thing. For our purposes here, though, here's the roughest outline. A relatively inexperienced individual finds a challenge or mystery. They leave the place they knew for somewhere new. New things are dangerous, but also offer great value. Challenges are overcome. A little bit of death, a little bit of rebirth. And the individual returns home more competent and or things are renewed. Dope. Now I've spoiled every book or movie you'll ever read and all the ones you won't. It's a huge time saver. You're welcome. But there's a reason that all the stories ever told can basically be boiled down into this format. You know, it's not a secret. It's just the structure of the phenomenological world when you're a creature like us who lives from past to future in a universe like this one. You will first exist somewhere, then you will want something, then you will go somewhere else and do something to fulfill that desire. And then you'll be back at the beginning, but also a little different. Or you don't, or won't, and then you're miserable. Or you fail at that thing so hard that you die. The point is, this is an inescapable pattern of life as a conscious living being in this kind of world. So I can give you the whole thing with an Oreo. You're sitting at home, happily going about your business, when suddenly you're struck with a craving. You are hungry, and your simple, comfortable existence is now in disarray. The voice of your past speaks to you. You have a pack of Oreos in the kitchen. Heeding the call to adventure, you journey across your home. You go there, overcoming the objects in your way and the siren call of just staying on the couch. Ultimately, you claim your prize. Eating the Oreos, you're filled with the sense of victory. Your body is renewed. You return to your day now refreshed, satiated. That's all. The human condition. Now do this forever until you die. Oof. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. Now, this is important because while the big myths and stories about the psyche and nature overall kind of outline all the aspects of human existence and their qualities in total, the hero's journey is more like how that plays out in particular. The first type lays out the phenomenological landscape you're waking up in. The latter is more, what do you do about it? You didn't actually create the universe. It was here before people. And a whole lot of people did a whole lot of stuff before you got here. And now you have to deal with it. Some left some good advice about how to have a good life and avoid mistakes. Some left a bunch of monstrous horror you're going to have to overcome. Best to stay wary, off you trot. Now, all this is still pretty abstract. Your obstacles are monsters, and your goal is a magic elixir or a particularly sexy monarch. But it's much closer to a unique individual existence in its day-to-day and year-to-year operations. Now, obviously, these things blend together to a ridiculous degree. The hero's journey also tends to be the level of analysis where a lot of lessons and cultural ideals lie. What makes the hero successful and the villain unsuccessful are the presence of certain qualities that allow them to succeed. When they do so, they learn particular lessons and bring them back in particular ways. These are the more specific ideas about how to be a good and successful person, as the people who came before you have managed to refine it up until now. This makes up the backbone about how a child, a new person, learns to understand their society and culture and how to live and thrive within it. Go forth and confront the unknown. Find the great cultural artifacts and lessons and revivify them. Then return back to rekindle civilization from whence you came. Honestly, if you want like a masterclass in the hero's journey, like in Joseph Campbell's conceptualization, go watch Black Panther. It hits every note perfectly. It is the hero's journey in every respect, from beginning to end. So what does all of this have to do with depression, ostensibly the topic of this video? Lots, actually, turns out. Depression is many things, but one of its defining characteristics is a loss of the sense of meaning. You struggle or don't, but neither is really more or less valuable than the other. It's a separation of the numinous quality at the core of these mythological structures. So, in Dark Souls, our player character is not a young, plucky adventurer setting off into an exciting unknown. Instead, you're an undead. You've been cursed sometime in the past, and now you're fated to die over and over again, slowly losing touch with your memories and identity until eventually your soul is just shaved totally away. Then you'll wander the land as a hollow, totally devoid of identity or will, shambling aimlessly, a frightening shell of your former self.
Your past, your future, your very light. None will have meaning, and you won't even care. By then, you'll be something other than human.
Because the Age of Fire is ending, and the land has fallen into disarray. The happy thoughts are long gone. The end times are here, my dude, and all is lost. But still, you gotta live in it.
Regrettably, I have failed in my mission, but perhaps you can keep the torch lit. There is an old saying in my family, "Thou who art undead art chosen, and thine exodus from the undead asylum maketh pilgrimage to the land of ancient lords. When thou ringeth the bell of awakening, The fate of the undead thou shalt know.
So you're given your call to adventure. A prophecy promising that one day an undead like yourself will go on a great journey to the land of the gods and rekindle the first flame, bring back life and prosperity while driving back the encroaching darkness with their radiant splendor. The hero's journey lies before you, even in the apocalypse. You can't escape your existence. Your only hope is to transform it. What Dark Souls asks then is, what if the hero's journey was a prison? If you're curious, the only way I make it through any artistic project is through the copious use of wine. Part the second, the individual and depression. Did you know that psychology means study of the soul? Like, it's an old Greek word. There's a lot of fun to be had with old Greek words. I just always thought that was funny. You know, how's your soul today? How's your fundamental locus of being relating to all of creation right now? Fucking wild. I don't know. It felt thematically relevant. So, to really get at depression as a phenomenon, I'm gonna have to get you in the mind of what I mean by the word. Really by affective states in general, but we're gonna focus on depression. I think one of the aspects of mental health that we don't bring up a lot is kind of just how much really falls under that umbrella. You know, to listen to people speak, it sounds like it's just something on their day planner, like something they manage in addition to their calendar and their bank account. But despite what common grammatical structure would suggest, we aren't actually abstract awarenesses that happen to be piloting a meat mecha. Meat and mind are one. We're not creatures living our lives while also having psychological experiences. Our lives are psychological experiences. There's no real distinction between the two. Now, I think the divide is pretty old, but we've really reinforced it over the last few centuries. Like, for sure, part of it goes back to the work on separating the objective from the subjective and naturalism and eventually science. But as this ever-ascendant drive towards rationalization and categorization becomes a society's defining ethic, it tends to push all those aspects of life which are squishy and experiential into a kind of non-existence. We've literally coined a term for this dilemma. It's called the hard problem of consciousness, which personally I love the creativity of the name. We've got a lot of problems, but this is the hard one. Basically, looking ahead, our greatest minds kind of recognize that no matter how well you can measure the firing of a neuron or the exact placement of a neurotransmitter, we won't actually be any closer to explaining why blue is experienced exactly the way you experience it, or even how to measure that experience. And funny enough, those are the most important parts of life. So it's kind of a big deal. You don't experience the wave-particle duality or the specific electromagnetic frequency of the photon. You see blue. And you see what blue means to you. And you see it in relation to all the other colors, all while you're already experiencing a certain mood and on and on and on all at once. Now, obviously, there is some controversy about this. Some folks are of the mind that after we understand the pieces well enough, this whole qualia thing will kind of work its way out in the wash. I personally think they're fools, but I'm also an unlanded rando on the internet, so I don't know, it's love then, right? But this rooting of your identity within a grounding of experience, that awareness and will are embedded in a fundamental system of values, all while we're driven endlessly to keep them separated. I mean, that's kind of the spirit of the age, a zeitgeist, if you will. Now, this divide is how you end up having conversations about how mindfulness seminars will increase productivity in a corporate workforce by some measurable percentage each fiscal quarter, or how multi-billion-dollar industries can arise around alleviating the symptoms of depression and anxiety. The subjective observes the objective until itself becoming an object. Then attempts to find objective means of altering its own subjectivity to be more in line with the values it is forced to treat as objective. Savvy? We've adopted this perspective so fully that your life, as conceptualized on the societal level, is mostly a process of acquiring and organizing a series of discrete and quantifiable elements. These can be manipulated through a universal medium of money. And anything that limits our ability to effectively enact the prescribed moveset is, by definition, a flaw to be ironed out. Your experience and values are framed and engaged with as stages within a kind of exchange. To be fed and assuaged or harnessed, certainly, but always as a means in some way. Rationally attempting to negotiate your way through a lens of cultural demands amidst universal limitations while measuring the quality of that existence by standards made outside and in total opposition to its nature.
Gwyn has blurred your past.
Oh, my video on depression is depressing me. The algorithm is older than the internet, is my point. We discuss our affective states like something we have, the way you might have a cold, or that happens to you the way a car crash might happen to you. From here, we can break down symptoms, categorize and study them, and discuss how each might arise within an individual, genetically, neurochemically, through interactions with the environment, etc., etc., etc. And before I move on, I want to say I don't think that this is wrong. I think there's a big distinction between rationality and instrumental rationality. Moreover, things exist at different scales. You can enjoy alcohol, but if you make it your god, your life will implode, right? Same with CrossFit. This ability to objectify is incredibly powerful and useful. I've put years of my life trying to understand all of these aspects because I believe that there is truth there, actionable, useful truth. It's my career path. The objective, rationalistic perspective is not evil or false. Our advancements in understanding have been real, and they're valuable improvements. So, trust your doctors, don't fall off your meds, take time to marvel at space flight and EDM festivals and seedless watermelons grown in previous deserts. My stance is not that rationality is false or unnatural. My stance is that it's incomplete. Made into the measure of all things, it's inhuman. Depression isn't low dopamine or serotonin, or a sense of grief lasting more than the expected amount of time, any more than temperature is the height of your thermostat, or The Lord of the Rings is the pixels on your TV. Depression is not something you have. It's something that you are through to the bones of your reality. And that's a truth that's difficult to address scientifically. It's a change in the actual quality of the things that you experience. The food you eat is bland. The music you hear is dull. Your thoughts are sluggish. Your body is an afterthought at best. When people make plans with you, they're a chore to do later. Your memories are hazy and dark. Your future plans are mechanistic at best or non-existent at worst. Your existence, your motivations, memories, aspirations, sensations, and emotions have shrunk into this dense cacophony of emptiness and pain. You live somewhere where time is slippery. You'll lose weeks or months into this vague fog. Every task is monumental, or worse, totally pointless.
Go through the door and trot along to the kingdom. But remember, hold on to your souls. They're all that keep you from going hollow. Oh, I'll fool you no longer. You'll lose your souls. All of them. Over and over again.
So Robert Sapolsky has given my favorite definition of depression to date.
Okay, so what are the symptoms about? If I had to define major depression in one sentence, I would say it's a biochemical disorder with a genetic component and early experience influences where somebody can't appreciate sunsets. And that's what this disease is about.
Depression is a wound to the actual structure of your existence. You know, on some level, if it was just like an injury or a regular illness, you'd feel like you could handle it. But the thing that's been injured is who and what you are. Your world is dead, and so are you, and so is the future, and so is the past. It's just a matter of time before the inertia runs out. This is a video about Dark Souls. So, you awaken in a prison with no knowledge of your past or how you got there. You receive a bit of help by way of a falling corpse and just enough exposition to set you on your way. Leave this place, ring the bell, unravel the mystery of the curse, tale as old as time. Now, a bit later, we'll also find out that we need to hunt down the pieces of the old gods, ascend to the divine city, and then become God, but that's after the bells. But the world you find yourself in is barely alive. The buildings are crumbling, no longer populated so much as haunted. You crawl through sewers and broken streets or through catacombs and cave systems, each populated by some manner of demon or ancient construct or vague monstrosity from a bygone era. Everyone you meet is also an undead like you, cursed with the same affliction and on about their lives under that particular sword of Damocles. Most of them appear in your life in short snippets, offering a small glimpse into their worlds, a few words in passing, for disappearing into obscurity again. And as for the rest of humanity, the course of the undead curse goes like this. Once afflicted, marked with the dark sign, as it were, you can no longer really die. True, you can technically be killed, but sooner or later, you will always awaken again at a bonfire, somewhere you've been before. And from there, you can go off and continue whatever it was that you were doing. However, with every death, your soul gets shaved down just a little bit more, leeching some of your vibrancy and color until eventually all that's left of you is some shambling, lethargic husk, unthinking, repeating the last motions of its previous life. Doomed to live on empty and mindless in a world that is rapidly losing any light at all. Some hollows attack you, venting some primal rage still smoldering in their gut. Others continue defending posts they watched in some time out of memory. Others merely sit there, hardly moving, showing no reaction to your presence. The world for them might as well not exist anymore. They've long since lost the ability to care. The bleakness of it all, the loss of vitality, the loneliness, the impossibility of everything. The feeling like you're going through the motions without having any idea why. feeling lost, like you just wander from place to place without a good idea of how they're supposed to fit together. Your mind slips from location to location and time to time. Every day seems endless, and yet you'll lose months without noticing it. Rather than being a text that discusses depression, Dark Souls takes the phenomenological approach and lets you experience it. It uses our basic mythological structure to put us in the landscape. That feeling of being a small thing scrounging through some dying and hostile land, the isolation of it, the sense that you will be fighting and dying to the same monsters again and again and again until you finally just give in. The ever-present fear that your life is slowly slipping away from you and you're losing any sense of self to hold on to.
Well, what are you going to do? I've already decided. I don't really care. I'm simply crestfallen.
So, right, we're back to myth. So, light represents consciousness as such, and Gwyn represents that concept embodied in beings like us. He also represents the accumulation of the artifacts of consciousness through time, the rules and structures handed down from the past, if you will. This place of psychic desolation has that feeling because it lacks the sense of meaning we're naturally inclined to seek. So we turn to the structures of the past we know for answers. How was it done before? How have other people achieved meaning in the past? How does one go on the hero's journey? You're given a prophecy that tells you to follow in the footsteps of Gwyn and to rekindle the first flame.
I bequeath the Lord Vessel to thee. And beseech thee, succeed Lord Gwyn, and inheriteth the fire of our world. Thou shalt endeth this eternal twilight, and avert further undead sacrifices.
Now, as you might imagine, souls play an important role in the Dark Souls narrative. The game is famously ambiguous about what exactly they are, but they're also a game-defining resource. Kind of life force you use to grow and to barter. It was the discovery of souls in the first flame that allowed the gods to create the Age of Fire to begin with. It's the collection of souls that allows you to grow your own power throughout the game, and ultimately what gives you the ability to link the fire and begin the world anew. Given that souls are intimately tied to the Age of Fire, which is also somehow the creation of time and change and difference and disparity, we can put forward the idea that souls are in some way the force or substance that allows for our ability to manipulate time, past and future, to understand ourselves as distinct entities, to move and make dynamic changes to ourselves and the world, and to make value judgments at all. All things that help define us as beings. It's the slow bleeding of this that constitutes the real terror of the undead curse. The difference between being a human and going hollow. Now, there's also the resource of humanity, but that changes throughout the series, and I'm not sure if I'm really going to touch on it here. As well, there's some textual indications that how souls and hollowing are connected is more complicated than you're led to believe, but I'm going to set all that aside for now. We'll circle back to it. Now, interestingly, if you pay attention to the NPC quest lines, you'll notice that it's not the countless deaths that lead a person to hollowing, but a final loss of hope. every person you actually talk to in the game is an undead, and therefore suffering from the curse as well. There are actually some characters who aren't undead. Famously, Sigmar's daughter is not, but whatever. Almost all of them are undead. Some of them go off and fight endlessly to fulfill their own goals, or the prophecy of the undead, or hell, just out of habit. Others seem to just hang out and talk to you. Neither choice, though, seems to determine just when or if that particular person is going to hollow. The Crestfallen Warrior, for example, never goes anywhere, but ends up a hollow outside of New Londo anyway after a single failed attempt fighting a big snake. Sigmar of Katarina, best boy, is an endless source of joy throughout the game if you manage to run into him. Though, as it becomes more and more apparent just how much of his progress has been due to you and not to his own power, you can hear a weight entering his voice in dialogue. It's only after finally receiving his wife's final words and solving the mystery of her death that he finally hollows out. Solaire, runner-up best boy, holds to an ancient kind of dream. Rather than lamenting the curse or the ending of the age, he claims to be on a quest to find his own son. Over time, though, this becomes harder and harder for him to believe in. Depending on your actions, he may go mad from a brain parasite or just become a defeated wreck. You can actually summon him at the end of the game, which has some interesting implications, but that's a whole other discussion. Rhea loses hope when she fails her companions and her pilgrimage, but keeps going to teach you miracles. After buying all of her miracles, thus ending her reason to keep going, you find her hollow in the Duke's archives. Lucatiel of Mira slowly loses her wits, terrified of the inevitable failing. Big Hat Logan technically goes mad studying the deepest natures of the soul and magic, but I don't know, it feels thematically consistent. I chalk that up to some divide between rationality and existence. Basically in trying to encompass all of creation with the intellect, the thing that spawns the intellect, is inherently paradoxical and leads to a kind of psychic collapse.
Or were you just here? This fascinating place defeats my sense of time.
These themes continue through all three games. I'm not going to list them all, but what matters is that each character is struggling desperately towards something, with some with an unflappable sense of optimism, others visibly struggling to hold it together. But it's always the striving itself that defines them, and the loss of that motivation that ends their story. Sometimes that comes through failure, other times simply through chasing something they could never really get. Either way, it's that slow loss of hope that hollows them. And I mean, this is really driven home through your own character as you play them. You know, so long as you keep booting up the game, sallying forth and choosing to smack the goddamn nameless king in his presumably smug face, that your character is alive. No matter how many times you fail, it's only when you decide it can't be done and stop loading in that your character is really and truly gone. So much for the curse. But there's another key element to this read. So, as I argued earlier, the world of Dark Souls lays out mythologically. It's giving you a phenomenological landscape. The world came into being at the separation of two opposed dyads, life and death, light and dark. light is our symbol of consciousness and rationality, but what about dark? Dark is the unconscious. And not in the Freudian sense of repressed desire, but more in the Jungian sense. The dark is the deep, unfathomable source of your emotions and your drives and your will. It's hunger and lust and love and hate and fear and joy and all of it. All these things aren't rationally arrived at. You don't decide to be angry. You decide what to do about it. In some sense, these things predate consciousness, but in the same way, they only really get defined once there's an awareness to define them. And there's textual evidence to back this up, too. The spells and items involving the dark tend to talk about will and emotion and the kind of drive towards life. It's a deep well of power for people to draw on. A lot of the legends and discussions about it tend to equate it with evil or with death, but that doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. We know from the creation myth and descriptions of humanity and the Dark Soul that humanity's fundamental nature was of the dark and that they coexisted with the gods for a long time. They fought in the wars with the ancient dragons and all of that. Moreover, many characters who pursue power through the dark are good and helpful friends, while many of those who claim to serve the light are shown to be murderers and liars.
As I said, I am Carla, and am grateful to you. Now, what shall we do? The only thing that might interest you is my sorcery. Although my dark arts are a detestable sort, that wouldn't interest you, would it? Oh, are you lost on your journey? No matter. Today's lost are conquerors tomorrow. It only demonstrates the makings of a champion. And besides, whatever your choice, it will not change my sense of gratitude or how I think of you.
Oh, it's you. You rescued Milady. Well, a pity that is, for it will amount to nothing, for the little madam is not worth her salt without her family name.
There are good and evil characters on both sides and sin to be had all around. So it can't be as simple as light good, dark bad. But the dark, while morally neutral, is anything but safe. So Dark Souls draws a distinction around certain concepts surrounding the dark. It's not a monolith. Specifically, these ideas break down into the dark, the abyss, and the deep. Now, the dark as a whole has a lot of ambiguity around its nature. It's described alternatively as a source of peace and tranquility, as well as a source of despair and brutality. This fits, though, as the unconscious is characterized by just this kind of complex ambiguity. On the one hand, it's the source of our primordial drives, so it's what puts the meaning and energy into our actions. It's why that particular person becomes an image of love for you. That sense of joy and meaning and promise, that rewriting of every part of your life into a story about you and them. Or the feeling of admiration you feel for a great artist or activist or astronaut. The fire to become something more like them. These are unconscious forces. At the same time, though, it's the source of animalistic, instinctual drives. The aggression that tells you to destroy whatever makes you afraid or to cower from it. The lust that rules and drives you regardless of how it might destroy your life. It's the warring field of all the bestial aspects of our nature. It's represented mythologically as the devouring mother, It's the source of our consciousness, but it's also Kali, consuming you anytime the mood strikes her. This is obviously representative of our eventual death and return to the cycle of nature as a whole, but it simultaneously represents a particular failure of consciousness. Being aware is hard when you're finite. You're constantly beset by a world you don't understand well. You're puppeted by desires you didn't choose, confused and fragile and constantly struggling. We feel a pull to return to that unconscious state where we didn't need awareness and could simply act out of instinct without reflection. It takes effort to remain conscious in life. As Neumann puts it, but fixation in unconsciousness, the downward drag of its specific gravity, cannot be called a desire to remain unconscious. On the contrary, that is the natural thing. There is, as a counteracting force, the desire to become conscious, a variable instinct impelling man in this direction. Given all this, it's expected that items and spells and characters associated with the dark would shift between ideas of serenity, bloody consumption, and powerful emotions overall.
The embrace of the dark is gentle. Let it absorb your sorrows forever.
What drew me to the dark? I do not know.
Exeter are more than mere tools to me.
I feel affinity and warmth, something universal, nostalgia even. Those who discover dark realize this, and they never come back.
Now, the abyss seems to be associated with the dark, but it's decidedly brutal. Man forged ancient weapons in the abyss. Artorias, the famous knight, was able to handle it for a time, but was ultimately overcome and becomes this embodiment of animalistic fury. The once proud knight now merely another monster. Manus is described as its source or avatar, depending on how you want to do the Japanese translations, but his exact relation to it is a little difficult to nail down. It's implied, though, that a sense of great loss drove him mad in some way, and that this began the spread of the abyss after his awakening.
Believe it or not, Ulusil has brought the abyss upon itself, fooled by that toothy serpent. They upturned the grave of primeval man and incited his ornery wrath. What could they have been thinking? But to you and I, it's all ancient history. You have to ask yourself, does it really matter?
I still think on that creature from the abyss that preyed upon me. My faculties were far from lucid, but I quite clearly sensed certain emotions. A wrenching nostalgia, a lost joy, an object of obsession, and a sincere hope to reclaim it. Could these thoughts belong to the beast from the abyss? But if that were true, then perhaps it is no beast after all. Oh, please forgive my ramblings. It's just that I wish to know the truth, and no one, not even loving Elizabeth, will tell me.
So, if the dark is the unconscious generally, I'd argue that the abyss is our emotions driven to a kind of madness. Anger is a part of you, but rage is you utterly consumed. Fear driven to panic, desire into this ravenous consumption. It's our desires constrained and tortured until they go insane and possess us. In Dark Souls 2, the remains of Manus' soul have actually grown into 4 distinct daughters. each a manifestation of a particular emotion of his, like wrath or fear or loneliness. Each wanders the world and ultimately attaches themselves to some powerful will represented by a monarch. And we see the fallout of these stories through their various kingdoms' histories. Thematically, it's worth pointing out, I think, that it wasn't actually the Daughters of the Abyss that destroyed these kings per se. They're cast in a pretty evil light, and many of their aims seem selfish or destructive, but as before, the line between good and evil doesn't always match the line between light and dark. For example, the Iron King was more than capable of destroying his kingdom and himself all on his own. And in the case of the Ivory King, we actually get a story of love and growth. Brief aside, the story of the Ivory King is one of my favorites. It's the kind of fairy tale I would probably tell my children, dark and dreary as it is. There's something about that tragic, heroic love story that lasts through endless time that just gets me. But any way you slice it, what I wanted to highlight here is that the Abyss is the dark, but specifically it's cast as a kind of wild emotionality and unconscious possession. It's not the natural state of the dark. As any depth psychologist would tell you, concepts of good and evil are complex. You can't simply say whatever is conscious and rational is definitionally good. That way leads to this kind of narrow mind and self-inflation that'll kill you just as easily as anger or desire will. Consciousness's great flaw is that it basically becomes Milton's Lucifer. It rejects the idea of a nature that transcends its own conceptions, imposes its will on the world, and ignores and destroys anything that doesn't fit the model it's tried to cast over everything. Because its plan and understanding are perfect, it ends up becoming a kind of despot, forever turning messy, living, growing things into predictable machines. It'll gladly build utopia if only everyone and everything would just act the way they're supposed to. The point being here that possession, archetypal possession, isn't something that's relegated just to powerful emotions. Megalomania is not the sort of thing that arises out of anger. It is tied to our belief in our ability to know and control everything around us consciously. Now, that all sounds pretty grandiose, but it's actually pretty simple to see this play out, even in our everyday lives. Things we don't understand rightly give us this sense of anxiety. Moving to a new place, starting a new relationship, whatever. Developing an understanding of how it works, building a model of it, helps to reduce that anxiety because we feel like we can predict it, or at least well enough to live with it. But because that model helps us to feel safe, and actually many of them actually do keep us safe, we have a natural tendency to resist anything that questions or dissolves them, because that would throw us right back into this place of total anxiety. Thomas Kuhn actually outlined this pretty well in The Sciences, where new and ultimately correct theories are heavily resisted by adherents to old theories because they question or discard ideas that are seen as unassailably true. Religion and conspiracy theories are another pretty obvious example where a person will do just about any amount of mental gymnastics to make their model of how things work fit the evidence they're presented with. But on a smaller scale even, it shows up just in our relationships to each other. People who suffer abuse as children often develop this deep sense of their own evil or broken nature. This is obviously complicated, but an underlying factor is that as a small and very vulnerable child, it gives a certain feeling of control if you conclude that the problem is you. You can always fix your behavior. What do you do if you live in a world that's actually capricious and dangerous? Even after leaving that environment and having a relatively safe and happy life, that mentality can underlie the rest of a person's day-to-day existence in any number of subtle ways. You know, it takes a lot of focused therapy to finally pull that idea up out of the roots and set somebody free from their own worldview. There was actually some pretty interesting research done a while back about like how we react to categories. In one study, they showed that kind of regardless of where exactly you draw a categorical boundary, people were more likely to rate things in that category as similar and things outside that category as different, regardless of how close or similar those things were actually. In another study with colors, it was shown that people who have words, which are just a kind of category, for shades of colors were actually better able to distinguish between those shades than people who didn't have words for them. Meaning, basically, that how we choose to perceive and separate the world into boxes has actual utility and does alter our perception of things. How you choose to name the world determines the kind of world that you see. Now, the point of all this isn't to be some kind of takedown of rational thought, even instrumental rational thought. It's mostly just to kind of point out an inherent tendency to this process. We absolutely need this kind of process in our thinking. There's far too much universe out there for us to live without some kind of simplifying mechanism. But with its utility, there is the danger that once you've established some kind of understanding about how the world works, it takes a lot to change it, even if it's obviously wrong or limited. Things outside the fold can even begin to appear as threats because they question everything that's keeping anxiety and helplessness at bay. It's a kind of focusing tool, but it also tends towards a kind of authoritarianism if you don't keep it in check. But, double-edged sword that it is, consciousness is our greatest achievement as a species. It's the long fight against the all-consuming cycle of nature. What gave us the ability to step outside of our desires and become more than just a tool for hunger or aggression or lust to express itself, instead to become the center that directs them. Concepts like justice, mercy, beauty, courage, they can only really be arrived at through conscious action. The ability to understand the past and the future and to make choices and bring about specific ends. So the whole dynamic becomes this constant battle between our models and powers and choice and the great sea of nature we arose out of. Through how we navigate these two forces, we might find insight and power, or a total loss of self, or we may unleash horrors.
There is one thing that you should know. There is a darkness within man, and I am afraid you will peer into it. Whether the fear will spark self-reflection or a ruinous nostalgia is up to you entirely.
So much for the abyss. What about the deep? So this was actually a little more complicated, but I think the key bit here is that the deep has this connection with heaviness, with weight. All the spell descriptions talk about the weight of sins sinking down to the depths of the earth. They tend to discuss things that bite and gnaw at you. I would argue that the deep, as it's dealt with in the game, is tied to feelings of guilt and shame specifically. These are the emotions we tend to associate with sin, which are concepts which can only really arise after self-consciousness exists, interestingly enough, which is why I think they're associated with the church specifically, and really only come up after a whole lot of civilization has passed in game. You know, the deep plays a big role in Dark Souls 3, but it isn't present at all in Dark Souls 1 and 2. I think you need a lot of time with these concepts to develop a robust idea of sin in a culture. But, you know, put another way, a tiger can't sin. It might kill, but it lacks the ability to murder somehow. The idea of sin requires a conceptualization of self and agency, and you need a standard to judge that self and agency by, you know, like a religious doctrine. We develop a moral system to help mediate all our competing desires and unconscious shapes. They tell us to be wary of certain parts of ourselves that tend to create more harm than good. But this opens up a new risk. We may develop a relationship to parts of our nature that denies them entirely, casting them out of awareness to starve, as it were, but cutting ourselves off from the vital force that they bring to us. You know, aggression is a good example of this. Obviously, unrestrained aggression makes us violent and impulsive monsters, but it's also the force that lets you stand up to injustice, you know, towards yourself or others. When something awful happens, it can be the force that energizes and focuses us to go do something about it. A person who's so guilty anytime they feel aggression ends up pretty powerless, losing a lot of agency and abusing themselves emotionally anytime they feel that rising up in them. It's obviously bad on its own, but that kind of dynamic can also lead to a person developing a hatred for themselves for being weak, and for anyone and everyone around them for being sources of envy and depression. Basically, it's Nietzsche's idea of ressentiment. This process is also a kind of blinding. If you can't admit to feelings of aggression because they mean you're a bad person, and then someone abuses you, you have to come up with elaborate explanations about either what you feel instead of anger, or you have to explain away the other person's behavior in a way that makes it so aggression was the wrong response. Either way, you have to cloud your own perceptions of the world and live in a kind of fantasy just to preserve the idea of yourself. Consciousness can be a light that lets us see, definitely. It can help us to find a way to compromise between all of our competing and warring desires so that they can coexist and strive together in a similar direction. But it can also become a torturer. You can learn to hate and repress parts of yourself rather than learning to exist as a full person. Guilt and shame are whips and bludgeons we use to subdue the parts of us we can't accept into that light of awareness. But that weight drags down the soul, makes it heavy. It stops the clear flow of our emotions and creates stagnation and rot. Eats at us, become twisted, gnawing horrors we can't bear to look at, and so fight against even harder.
Who is there? Is someone there? Anyone? Oh, please, whoever you are, touch me. The dark surrounds me, nibbles at my flesh. Little creatures, they never stop biting. So please, hold out your hand and touch me.
Irina's questline shows this really well, actually. You know, firekeepers are deeply tied to bonfires. The description on a firekeeper's souls actually specify that they are these masses of darkness and humanity. When we meet Irina, she's a terrified mess and mentions that she was unfit to become a firekeeper because of her weakness. She's scared of the dark, the small creatures that gnaw at her. Now, depending on what stories you have her read to you, she either falls deeper into fear and isolation and eventually asks you to kill her, or if she fulfills her duty as she sees it, she successfully becomes a firekeeper. Basically, she can read explanations of reality, miracles, that reinforce a sense of self-hatred and horror in her, or she can read explanations that speak towards a kind of personal power. In other words, Irene has developed a particular relationship with her unconscious that's full of guilt and fear, and it eats at her daily. However, after she reads you all of the miracles and finds a sense of her own strength, she's finally able to embrace the darkness so completely that she becomes a firekeeper, the thing that masters darkness and humanity and manages the fires of resurrection. It's when she's afraid and rejects her own nature that she experiences it in that gnawing, biting way that deep spells describe it. But that is not the intrinsic nature of the dark. The Locust Priest in the Ring City basically says as much.
And so, she lived in fear of the dark, of the things that gnawed at her flesh, and yet the abyss hath yet to produce any such creature. Fear not the dark, my friend, and let the feast begin.
That dude definitely seems trustworthy. So, circling back, keep in mind that there's an interlocking nature between light and dark. While on one level the two seem to be opposed, they in fact work in concert and coexist. And how, contrary to the initial read, this isn't a story about good versus evil, but about nature and balance versus a corruption of the soul. And that's huge because, as I stated a while back, depression isn't just a set of symptoms. It's a global state that affects everything about you. It is the dimming of consciousness, alienation from your will and your emotions, a sense of numbness, of suffering. Suffering makes you sensitive, quick to anger, quick to despair. You might lash out at everything around you with no good reason one moment and then collapse into an apathetic pile in the next. But at least in Dark Souls, that process only arises once we've divorced ourselves from our own nature in some way, either through fear or habit or categorically. Without that connection, a person can't really experience positive emotions or meaning because the source of those feelings is narrowed or cut off entirely. There's no way to envision change. The world becomes mechanical. It's your cosmos, corrupted and stagnant and in disarray. Dark Souls doesn't just talk about depression, and it doesn't just make you feel sad and hopeless. It's an entire philosophical discussion of the experience played out through your own actions. Now, I've invoked the word phenomenology a few times now, and so far I have not bothered to define it. Partly, I felt like I'd really kind of stacked a lot of philosophy up front, and I didn't want to make this too top-heavy. And partly because I thought the ideas would be easier after a bit of time with the mythology as history and psyche idea. But honestly, mostly because the first time I wrote this essay, I had a 10,000 word opening just full of phrases like Dasein and had not mentioned Dark Souls once. Believe it or not, this is actually the concise version of this video. But I don't think I can get away with not discussing it. So we're going to do the quickest class on Heidegger that's ever been attempted. Right, so Back in the early and mid 20th century or so, some people started thinking that maybe we got a bit off track a few thousand years ago and thinking about reality. You know, given that we still had a few pretty insoluble philosophical problems floating around, and there were some noticeable cracks in the whole mind-body dualism thing that were becoming more apparent at each passing decade, like we talked about earlier, people started wondering if maybe we needed to re-examine some core assumptions about what constituted reality, maybe how we go about examining it entirely. So they got the idea that maybe we started getting wrapped up in the contemplation of ideal forms and abstract images of, love and justice and all that, and that maybe we'd gone a bit sideways and need to get back to basics. Heidegger is one of these malcontents, and the one who came up with most of the terms that make phenomenology just impossible to bring up at parties. In his mind, there wasn't a whole lot of sense in talking about human nature in some kind of broad, objective sense. Instead, human beings have no fixed essence. They're unique in that they need to interpret themselves as a part of their nature. Basically, you're a process, a meeting place of many things, and the outside and the inside were constantly influencing each other. Human beings are thrown into the world, and we interpret ourselves through the world around us. Nature, culture, moment-to-moment changes, all of that. We're surrounded by tools and objects and other people and language and opinions and stories, all of which have been handed down from one generation to the next, each made in context of what came before and affecting everything around it being affected in turn, laying the starting state for whatever comes next. All this goes back into the deepest dimness of time forever and ever, amen. Now, because of this, and because of the kinds of beings that we are, the world implies certain things just based on its structure and yours. A hammer shape tells you that it can be gripped and held. The flat end tells you that it can strike, that it's made of wood and metal, that it was something that was created and made for a purpose. It implies the existence of nails and furniture and other people to use that furniture. Moreover, we're not merely some clear point of rational awareness observing a static reality. No matter what your ego may argue, we're creatures of moods. Those moods highlight certain portions of reality. Being tired shines a light on possible ways you might get to sleep. It also reframes anything around you that may get in the way as an obstacle or an enemy, if you want to get a little extreme about it. But, most times, of most days, you don't ever notice that hammer. When you need to hang a picture, though, it springs to mind of its own accord. If your significant other one day decided to murder you, it might spring to mind as a weapon to defend yourself. Or maybe it's a paperweight. Or it's the thing your mother always had hanging from her belt loop, what have you. The point being, you don't see a world of objects and then infer their use and meaning, but instead your current state, the world and history, and all the possible intersections of those things are blended together in the same time through your perception. So reality, whatever it is you might mean by that word, is all those things at once. A place of history, interpretation, motivation, feeling, action, blindness thinking, if you will. And that's Dark Souls. You can play this entire game from beginning to end and know practically nothing about its story or lore. Why is that? I mean that technically. How is that possible? You don't know your history. You don't know where you are. You don't have the faintest idea what on earth an undead or the Age of Fire or any of this is. Your tutorial is a handful of short messages listing the correct buttons to press, and yet you can defeat every enemy and solve every puzzle and successfully link the fire at the heart of the world, all while having no earthly idea why you did any of it at all. How? Well, because thrownness and constant interpretation are already your existential norm. You are already shaped to interact with the world and narratives in a particular way. That's just the kind of creature you've always been. The world has always implied itself. You know that you need to move forward and explore. You see an object of certain dimensions, and your body naturally reacts to grip it. Through culture, you know that a sword implies combat and that people attacking you are enemies. Your emotions demand that you preserve your life when in danger. Your curiosity drives you to seek. Your inner Nietzsche wills you to express yourself in the world. Cities imply people, and their absence evokes questions, and on and on and on. Now, all throughout this, the game makes you do these things, not just think about them, though it invites you to do so, but it makes you actively choose a path and to walk it. It makes you choose to face that impossible task again and again and again. It makes you walk back through desolation each time. And because of all of that, when you improve, it's not just a character in the game that's better, but your own reflexes and wisdom and patience that have improved. Dark Souls blends mythology and history and the hero's journey and the sense of meaning seeking and progression into a world and a set of mechanics, and gives you nothing else at all. And you have no trouble getting through its labyrinth because that's how it's always been. That is the world. Because that's you. Honestly, it's the most incredible piece of genuinely phenomenological art I've ever seen. Visually and musically and all the subtle bits of storytelling. You have to wade through a strange and nearly incomprehensible dying world. It hurls archetypes and motifs in your face and then sends you forth weak and alone to die endlessly for a cause you have to figure out along the way. Time seems so fluid and the past and future crash together haphazardly. You meet people in passing and may or may not ever see them again. Regardless, you're given this lonely struggle against impossible odds, all hinging on the hope that the words you heard when you first woke up were true. Because if not, there isn't anything else for you to do at all. And every time you die, you have to wake up having lost all of the power and vitality you struggled so hard along the way to gather, and make a physical decision with your own stupid hands to go out again or to stop forever. The light is faded. The corrupted remains seek to dominate and abuse you. The dark seeks to consume you with the slightest slip up, and all the while you trudge on under a constant state of threat and meaninglessness with no better reason than that's the only thing for you to do. And I mean, damn Miyazaki, you pulled it off. the game about depression. You know, part of what makes depression so difficult to handle is that it steals your ability to see the future and to contextualize the past. It robs you of your place and time in the world. The pain state expands until all of your memories are tinged with it before just kind of fading into obscurity. And honestly, looking ahead, the only thing you can imagine is more of the same, just marching forward endlessly until it all inevitably collapses. The world you find yourself in Dark Souls is slowly collapsing in both space and time. Kingdoms and people from far away and long ago are beginning to smash together and to overlap as the first flame goes out. At the end of the Age of Fire, all places and times are pretty much the same. History and identity blending haphazardly in the collapse. You sift through scattered items from times you can hardly imagine, left with just a snippet of information here and there. The people you meet flicker out of your life almost as soon as they've entered it. Quickly forgotten, honestly, as the next impossible monster begins using your body as a stress ball. And honestly, you wanted to rub the real punchline to the whole thing. And spoilers ahead, if you somehow watched this video up to this point and have no idea how Dark Souls ends, and that's important to you, the final insult of all of it was that the whole quest you were sent on was a lie to begin with. The gods died long ago, either burning out or fleeing. They've left you here to chase down a legend that they made up because they knew it would sound good to you and that you don't know any better. It was all just a slaughterhouse designed to throw bodies at a problem, hoping someone eventually might solve it. Which brings us to part the third. Dark Souls is secretly about late-stage neoliberal capitalism. That's right. The whole essay has been a trapdoor into BreadTube the whole time. The discourse consumes all. But there is an important connection here, and I swear it is all Gucci in the end. Because Dark Souls is not just a game about the human psyche writ large across the world. It's also about the way that world operates, what lays its foundations, and how those things play out. Because society, civilization, the capital W world are every bit as much a part of our psyche as our thoughts and affects. The two are the same process. To that end, though, we're going to have to talk a little bit about capitalism and neoliberalism. And my dead love, Hannah Arendt, who I will always find a way to talk about, no matter how much strain it puts on my actual meat-space relationships. Now, in her words, labor is the activity which corresponds to the biological process of the human body, and whose spontaneous growth, metabolism, and eventual decay are bound to the vital necessities produced and fed into the life process by labor. The human condition of labor is life itself. So, the realm of labor is deeply cyclical. It's tied directly to our being natural, biological beings in a world built like this one. It's a fundamentally consumptive and repeating kind of thing to be. You wake up and you need to eat. You expend some kind of energy and manage to eat, and you are immediately rewarded in the act of eating. But soon enough, you also need to eat again. It's the same way with an animal being born, going through a life very similar to the lives of every member of its species before and after, and then having another version of itself to go repeat the process. If it's successful, it reproduces another animal very similar to itself to fulfill and repeat that pattern that it is a part of and an embodiment of. Waking and sleeping, breathe in, breathe out, circle of life, that whole thing. So here, through labor and the products of labor, is the world humans share with all of life. Its products are bound and defined by their fleeting nature. Everything has to return to the cycle. Now, hopefully you can see some of the resonance with the Jungian ideas around the ascent of consciousness and biology as such. You know, that all-consuming mother figure that we talked about in kind of the archetypal discussion. So her second bit, work. Work is the activity which corresponds to the unnaturalness of human existence, which is not embedded in and whose mortality is not compensated by the species' ever-recurring life cycle. Work provides an artificial world of things, distinctly different from all natural surroundings. Within its borders, each individual life is housed, while the world itself is meant to outlast and transcend them all. The human condition of work is worldliness. So in work, we've moved closer to the distinctly human, as opposed to just the merely biological. Because whatever else we may be, human beings are not merely iterations of the species character. We're also self-conscious actors, aware of our own particular experience and able to act and create in the world. We know we're unique and that we are finite in time and space. You know, perhaps there's comfort in knowing that your descendants and beings very much like you will continue after you die. But while nature is a cycle, your own life is a straight line, and it's got a decided beginning and end. And this is the thing we are intimately familiar with. The nature of work is like that line. It's a culmination. There's a tangible and enduring object that doesn't need to be consumed at the end. Once you've made a chair, you just have a chair, entropy aside. You don't inherently need to go and create another chair every time you need to sit. Moreover, it's the products of work that come to make up what is broadly defined as the world, which is specifically that enduring human space we're all born into. Civilization, broadly speaking, is the accumulation of the works of human beings through the ages. You can see that literally in the roads and the books and the infrastructure, but probably more influentially in the ideas and systems and objects that help to maintain the form of that civilization. Because while a civilization might appear to be monolithic and unassailable, it is only that so long as people keep acting it out in their daily lives. You know, if everyone suddenly stopped accepting wages for work, or didn't show up to vote, or stopped following the laws as they were written, then even these great behemoths of society, like market forces and democratic processes, would just cease to be immediately, evaporate. These things are a collective dream we manifest through acting them out. So while you and another person might be in yourselves the cosmic children of stardust and the eternal prismed through the biological lattice of the human being, you're doing so in a particular city, using a particular language, and you will relate to each other through the particular works present at that time-space coordinate. You will grow to understand each other and yourself in relation to what you are trying to do with the things around you. The nature of that city and its design, the cultural understandings and tools you're born into will shape how you go about your goals, frame what those goals even are. And as others do the same, you'll know each other through that particular world. Because while humans can work to change the nature of our condition, that new condition changes us in kind. A person born into the internet is necessarily different than a person born into a small agrarian band without writing. Not different in value, but as phenomenological beings, our psyches are every bit as much our culture and our companions as it is our neurons. That's foreshadowing, by the way. It's going to come back around again. I don't know if you're noticing a theme. So action is perhaps the most ephemeral of the elements, but also perhaps the most distinctly human, at least in this book. So, as she puts it, action is the only activity that goes on directly between men without the intermediary of things or matter. Corresponds to the human condition of plurality, to the fact that men, not man, live on the earth and inhabit the world. Basically, it is a description of the fact that we are free-acting agents amongst each other, and that what we do, both in actual action and in speech, is what actually moves the world forward. Because we are most definitely biological beings bound to the great circle of life and death, just as we are the products of our works and the works of others as we find them scattered about, we are also in every moment beings with particular natures and perspectives who act amongst each other. And this is key. Action is infinitesimally fleeting in an instant, right? Hector kills Patroclus, or he doesn't. And he may debate his reasons, but in the end he acts, and that action directly alters the course of the Trojan War, enraging Achilles, who himself then acts, and then hop, skip, and a jump, and before you know it, the Roman Emperor Constantine is converting his entire state to Christianity, and on and on and on to today. Martin Luther King made impassioned speeches and acts of protest that shaped one of the most impactful movements in the history of the United States. JFK chose to wait during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Nikita Khrushchev did so in kind. Action is the locus of unique and chaotic impact that defines the distinctly individual nature of human existence, shapes the ongoing conversation between humanity as a whole. It's the distilled expression of a person's specific existence through the infinite matrix of exactly where and when they are in time, affecting the world of everyone through their lens of the nature in the world as they see it. What makes action so compelling as well as intimidating is that while it might be the most exalted expression of humanity, it is entirely unpredictable. A small choice may spread wildly through time and evolve in ways no one could possibly predict. Your choice to speak or not to speak will directly affect the collective space around you, and those people will then make actions in kind on forever and ever and ever. You may be able to appreciate why so many of these dead Greek philosophers and artists crowed endlessly about the importance of courage as a virtue and the many ways in which our choices may go right or wrong. It was the thing that defined a human being's place in the greater scheme of the cosmos. What you did echoed through eternity. So why do I say all this? Well, again, we're still mapping out the constituent elements of the phenomenological landscape. This tripart interplay between the wider natural cycle, the specific structured cultural world built on top of it, and that erratic force of individual free will contained within both. Remember, these are the building blocks of existence.
And that's important because we're still actually talking about the same stuff we were talking about before, but we've added in a new take on one of the previous dimensions, right? Part of the human condition is the ways in which we address that. And part of the ways we address that is through society and civilization as the place where our works, those things that we make linearly, kind of in opposition to the cycle, accumulate. The world, society, however you want to think about it, is a thing that we built for ourselves to live within under our own terms in some kind of opposition to a natural world which demands our cessation and our usurpation. But there's obviously a conflict there because we don't stop being part of the natural cycle, nor do we stop being the chaotic beings of action that we are. So you find yourself in this position where the three elements that make up being human are in conflict with themselves and reality and our own psyche, and it's a fractal, right? The world is our shelter, but it demands of us that we also fit its shape. Remember, people condition the world but are conditioned by it. That's the give and take, and it can become self-perpetuating in that way. You build a thing to deal with the world and the people within it, but what happens to that world when the circumstances or the people within it have shifted? We seek immortality through our creations and the things that we build and that we leave behind. However, that immortality has to exist through individuals living out their lives, and so you have to have a give and take between the demands of the world at large, the environment, and the needs, actions, and individual natures of the people living within it. That can definitely get out of sorts, though. You have this situation where you begin worshiping the thing that was created more than the thing it was meant to do, which is to house humans, to give them a place to act out those things which are distinctly human, to lead human lives. And that's kind of where we're going to get into the discussion about capitalism and where a thing that is built can overtake its own context and to lead to a kind of dystopia of the dead, where things that happened long ago are perpetuated because we feel the need to carry them forward. To abandon them is existentially terrifying, and in the face of that, any sacrifice is better than simply allowing it to pass.
For most people, on their first playthrough of Dark Souls, you find yourself very naturally following the breadcrumbs laid out before you to relink the fire and save the world. However, if you play with a mind towards exploration and interpretation, perhaps finding your way to New Londo a little bit earlier than expected, then a more sinister story is presented to you. Having defeated the Eternal Dragons, Gwyn establishes his Age of Fire, and by all accounts, it's pretty alright. I mean, no doubt, there were heroes and villains, and a lot of complexity, but on the whole, it built a system of values with a kind of nobility and greatness to it. But as is the nature of fire, it was destined one day to go out, and everything built would fade into nothing, absorbed back into the great cycle. This was not okay with Gwyn. Gwyn feared this more than anything, and in the end refused to let it come to pass. The primordial serpent Frampt tells a story of your prophesied coming to take up the mantle of Gwyn, who in the end sacrificed himself to rekindle the fire and thus preserve the world in goodness for all.
Chosen undead, your fate is to succeed the great Lord Gwyn, so that you may link the fire, cast away the dark, and undo the curse of the undead. To this end, you must visit Anor Londo and acquire the Lord Vessel.
But if you find him, Darkstalker Koth tells a slightly different story. In his telling, Gwyn had placed the undead curse on humanity and hidden that fact from them in the name of prolonging his age at the expense of our own. Rather than letting the natural course of things continue, he tried everything in his power to keep things as they were, to fight the tides of the unknown.
The truth I shall share without sentiment. After the advent of fire, the ancient lords found the three souls, but your progenitor found a fourth, unique soul, the dark soul. Your ancestor claimed the dark souls and waited for fire to subside. However, Lord Gwyn trembled at the dark, clinging to his age of fire, and in dire fear of humans, Lord Gwyn resisted the course of nature by sacrificing himself to link the fire and commanding his children to shepherd the humans. Gwyn has blurred your past to prevent the birth of the Dark Lord.
We actually find out a bit more about this in Dark Souls 3, specifically when you get to the Ringed City. It's revealed that sometime during the war against the dragons, humanity actually had its own separate civilization. Now, we don't know exactly what this looked like, what's meant by that, but we know that there were Ringed Knights who forged weapon and armor with descriptions that say they were made by humans in the Abyss for this war. So, whatever it was fairly long-running and cohesive. But Gwyn made a deal with humanity. In exchange for their help in the war, he would gift them with a great city and many other fine things. Maybe the most important gift, and the darkest, was his youngest daughter, Filianor. Now, Filianor would come to the Ringed City and sleep and dream forever. But in doing so, time would never pass in the Ringed City. The lords there could live forever in their own private world. And as part of all of this, Gwyn bound the nature of humanity, the Dark Soul itself, to the first flame. It's symbolized by that fiery ring around a black center we've been seeing throughout the game. This entire exchange was meant as a kind of taming of the wild nature of the Dark Soul, the thing Gwyn saw as ultimately ending his age of light and order. It was there to bind the fate of humanity directly to the fate of the first flame, to sequester their history in a land at the edge of the world and out of time. Something to be forgotten and dispelled in a prison, freely chosen, disguised as a gift.
As a senior citizen, are you willing to take a chance on your survival in exchange for keeping the America that all America loves for your children and grandchildren? And if that's the exchange, I'm all in. There are lots of grandparents out there in this country, like me, I have 6 grandchildren, that what we all care about and what we love more than anything are those children. I don't want the whole country to be sacrificed.
Remember all that stuff about the hero's journey being both an inescapable map of being alive, but also mediated by culture as a means of codifying proper human action. In Dark Souls 1, after ringing the bells and fighting your way up to the City of the Gods, you're given the final part of your quest by the daughter of Guinevere. What can I say? The dude had a theme. And you may go through the entire game believing that's what happened. However, as you may have picked up on, all is not as it seems. If, for whatever reason, you attack her, it's revealed pretty quickly that she is an illusion. Walk outside, and you'll find that the sun itself was an elaborate illusion, all just to hide how dire things had gotten in the waning days of fire.
Thou that tarnisheth the Godmother's image, I am Gwyndolin. And thy transgression shall not go unpunished. Thou shalt perish in the twilight of Anor Londo.
Despite his best efforts, Gwyn has failed to preserve his age. By its nature, fire needs fuel, and the first flame is dying. Defeated in his campaign against the demons, who weren't just monsters, by the way, they were a rival civilization and culture with art and architecture and religion. They persist long after the events of Dark Souls 1. Gwyn ultimately sacrifices his own life and uses his soul as kindling to keep the fire burning. And by all accounts, this seems to actually work for a time. But only for a time. By the time you begin Dark Souls 1, not only is Gwyn dead, but his firstborn has been exiled and stricken from history. His daughter fled with her lover long ago, apparently. The great knights have long since passed or succumbed to some kind of awful fate. The only one remaining is Gwyndolin, the secret and deformed son-daughter still clinging to the dream of her dying father. He cast the illusion that you've been walking through, making you believe in the nature of your quest and pulling your strings. In fact, the legend was disseminated through the land, and likely institutions like the church were established specifically to shepherd undead like yourself here for just this reason. Because without another Lord Soul to burn, the new plan is to use humanity itself as the kindling. As it's now bound to the flame, it can be used in this way. And so a massive conspiracy is hatched and cast in light, destined to pull undead after undead through a series of trials, gathering the strength and tools necessary to link the flame, harnessing their own power in a desperate attempt to prolong the age. If you look at the bonfires, you may notice that what they're burning is actually human bones. This world, this quest, Frampt and the City of the Gods, it's a slaughterhouse designed to consume the very beings it so long ago enslaved.
And McMillan, a 56-year-old lawyer in Mesa, California, near San Diego, responded in more detail, tweeting, "The fundamental problem is whether we're going to tank the entire economy to save 2.5% of the population, which is, 1, generally expensive to maintain, and 2, not productive."
In Arendt's view, human history up to the middle of the 20th century had managed to do something pretty stupendous, if also horrific, in seeking to build a world distinctly for ourselves, outside of nature. the place we could achieve a kind of paradise and immortality through our works, we had inadvertently and slowly trapped ourselves in a kind of paradox. The economic system of capitalism opened up a tremendous amount of material possibility and allowed it to flow more freely than at any time in human history. And industrialism had created the means of turning the repetitive nature of labor into a pretty efficient process, into an automated machine. And in many ways, these things were wonderful in their time and context, allowing a kind of material prosperity that people not have truly imagined for centuries before that. And it also seemed that every year that went by, the expansion of civilization eradicated another problem or another curse from the lives of the people who lived under its yoke. But as it did so, it created an ethic. It did so by weaving a myth. The ethic of capitalism, in a word, is profitability. And the ethic of industrialism, in a word, is efficiency. Those concepts, coupled to the utopian ideas of a life free from toil and sickness and suffering, married to the promise of making a life one always dreamed just through your own cleverness and courage and ability, these things became the bedrock of the new collective dream. And as we are beings conditioned by the world we build, soon that just became the thing that made the human soul. The human condition comprehends more than the conditions under which life has been given to man. Men are conditioned beings because everything they come into contact with turns immediately into a condition of their existence. The world in which the Vita Activa spends itself consists of things produced by human activities. But the things that owe their existence exclusively to men nevertheless constantly condition their human makers. A little later in the text, labor implements are drawn into this rhythm until body and tool swing in the same repetitive movement. That is, until the use of machines, which of all implements are best suited to the performance of the animal laborans, it is no longer the body's movements that determine the implement's movements, but the machine's movements which enforce the movements of the body. In trying to escape the cycle of nature, we'd created in our world the exact same labor cycle for ourselves, unleashing a process that constantly sought to expand, seeking new markets and new means of making money in this case. Eventually that process turned inwards. It makes perfect sense to make objects that degrade or to develop mentalities that need to constantly buy the latest version of something, because then the money continues to flow. People who have durable objects and whose needs are met do not need to consume. Work, the production of durable things, must be converted to labor, and the products of its process must become another consumable in the cycle. And this process atomized us as humans, simplifying our tasks in the name of efficiency, distributing resources through wages yoked to profitability, slowly turning money into the great object by which humans could relate to each other. That is, turning money into the only world left to us. And eventually, through this process, binding our lives so completely into the process that the people within it can't really conceive of a truly different kind of existence, even while it slowly demands that every act of love or hate or creativity be somehow commodified and consumed as part of this grand cycle of commerce. As the age of fire ends again and again and again, it is seen as good and right and proper that this act be done, because for the age of fire to end means the end of life, at least as people see it. A prison disguised as a gift. A slaughterhouse. It's pretty heavy. I should probably bring some levity into this. Like, take a breather, digest a bit, maybe talk about how goofy the primordial serpent design is, because, like, no joke, these dudes are great. The growl that Frampt gives, his triumphant growl, is like my favorite thing.
Forgive me. I really should calm down.
So I know I'm talking pretty heavy about capitalism here, and don't worry, neoliberalism is around the corner. But I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to talk about Arendt and Marx. We've kind of got this mentality where the great choices are played out along a spectrum, spread somewhere between communism on the left and, I don't know, like libertarian fascism on the right. But Arendt, in her view of the human condition through history, was equally as critical of Marxist thoughts as she was of the great cultural march of the West, or whatever the kids are calling it these days. She saw him as every bit as immersed in the whole process as anyone else. His belief was basically that this process would ultimately lead to humanity's emancipation from everything, I suppose, through material plenty. He just thought we'd also shrug off our leaders and be nicer to each other along the way. Also, a violent overthrow of the oppressors, but, I'm paraphrasing a lot of work here. But in her estimation, this too was part of the overall materialistic perspective that birthed what it was opposed to. That he may have been particularly insightful about certain inevitabilities in the structure of industrial capitalism, but that he hadn't transcended the greater myth as a whole. And this is a position I personally tend to agree with, obviously, so I'm talking about it. But we're not talking about the nature of communism here. I've already 14,000 words into this, and we are not done yet. I just figured I would head off some of the inevitable debates and interpretations. Basically, if you see anybody commenting on this video about how it's some kind of communist propaganda or whatever, just know that they couldn't hang this far and mock the weakness of their bloodlines publicly on the internet. All right, moving on. So I have to talk briefly, at least, about neoliberalism to really round this out. Partly because it's germane, but also because it's thematically relevant. Wine. So neoliberalism is one of those words that gets name dropped a lot, but it's also kind of weird and ephemeral. Broadly speaking, it's an ideology based in the ideas of a guy named Friedrich Hayek, and it posits that all sectors of life are run best through the generally industrial capitalist ethic that underlies modern free markets. It's the roots of the small government pro-business politics and policy that folks like Reagan and Thatcher espoused, and best believe it is alive and well. Now, historically, it really took off as the new hotness in the 70s, with worries about things like stagflation and such, which were problems both for individuals living within the economy, who were quickly finding everything too expensive to afford on the wages they had, but equally it spelled disaster for the global hegemony of the United States and friends, right smack in the middle of the Cold War. For those of you keeping score, you might notice not much has changed. Now, more or less, the philosophy promised to reinvigorate the economy and bring back the good old days everybody had enjoyed right after that tussle with the Nazis a few years back. And you know what? It did just that. At a price. Later, it formed the basis for decisions made during the 80s that began a cycle of credit and finance and elaborate economic shell games that built the boom of the 1980s and led inexorably towards the housing market collapse of 2008 and smack dab into the world we're living in today. Now, what's key here is that often when people are talking about positively or negatively, when they're discussing or lamenting the universal nature of capital C capitalism, what they're really discussing is this kind of complex alliance between capitalism, industrialism, and neoliberalism as it slowly consumed every aspect of public and private life. Neoliberalism was something like the Fast and Furious NOS boost to the whole show. It's doing meth to pull an all-nighter, or more narratively, as the Age of Fire came to close, its custodians had to resort to more and more extreme measures to keep the whole thing afloat. Each sacrifice needing to come more swiftly than the last, each revival less and less effective as the body slowly devours itself to stay alive, spreading itself thinner and thinner as the inevitable closes in. By Dark Souls 2, you can comb through a pile of kingdoms, each grand in its own way, each inevitably beset by the undead curse, and each ultimately just the forgotten rubble, making up the foundation of the kingdom that comes after. All of these inevitably following the pattern of decay that characterized all of the rest. In a memory, you can meet former King Vendrick, and he muses on the inescapability of this cycle.
Seeker of fire, deliverer of crowns. What do you see in the flames? Find the crowns and your own answers. The crowns hold the strength of lords from times long past. Seek adversity, as befits you, seeker of fire, coveter of the throne. I too sought fire once. With fire, they say, a true king can harness the curse. A lie, but I knew no better. Seeker of fire, you know not the depth of dark within you. It grows deeper still, the more flame you covet. One day fire will fade, and dark will become a curse. Men will be free from death, left to wander eternally. Dark will again be ours, and in our true shape, we can bury the false legends of yore. Only, is this our only choice?
By the time of Dark Souls 3, the whole world is becoming ash. The prince who was raised and elected to link the fire has abandoned his duty. In desperation, former heroes who linked the fire in the past have been resurrected in the hopes that combined they might provide what's necessary to keep the age alive. But they too have refused to serve. In a last-ditch effort, the ash of those who tried to link the fire and failed have been brought back to life and tasked with hunting down these previous lords of cinders to force themselves to sacrifice their lives for the good of all. At the borders of the ringed city, the rubble of time and space spirals into a chaos of overlapping destruction, everything collapsing inwards toward the inevitable. The ash is so high you can use it to soften your fall. And when you finally break the spell of time by waking Filianor and reality sets in, the world has become an endless plain of ash, harboring just a few faint ruins and a single pygmy lord being hunted for his blood. When you link the fire in Dark Souls 1, you release this explosion of flame that engulfs everything around it. When you link the fire in Dark Souls 3, your single lonely form begins to quietly smolder as you sit down beneath a dying sun to wait. The world is stretched thin. We cannot do this forever. The soul of the world has been worn away. In his book, The Global Minotaur, and honestly, most every book he's written as best I can tell, economist and former Greek financial minister Yanis Varoufakis lays out explicitly how economic and political decisions were made after World War II that ultimately led the United States, which by the 70s had ceased to become a surplus economy and was thus on the decline, to create a system in which instead it would recycle the surplus of other nations through Wall Street using finance. This allowed the hegemony to continue, but it radically destabilized the structure of the machine. More and more elaborate financial tools were developed in the name of endless growth, and skip a bit ahead, and the housing market crashes in 2008, leading to a global recession and threatens the entire economic game with collapse. This economic crisis led the EU to crushing the entire Greek nation into near collapse in an endless succession of austerity measures and calls for their now starving economy to pay back their loans. A strategy which we should stress was antithetical to the entire economic logic that spawned it. In fighting with Brussels and the EU, Varoufakis pointed out the logical idea of restructuring the debt, thinking that people might actually want their money back. This was flat out refused on multiple occasions. He pointed out that his entire administration had been elected by the people of Greece to negotiate just such a plan so that they might actually have a chance at, having a working country. That developing a payment plan would not only save the nation of Greece, but would also allow the creditors to actually get the money they were owed. After going around in circles on this, eventually he was told more or less directly that the democratic process of Greece was of no account and was going to be ignored in the name of economic concerns, and that everyone was well aware that their policy was illogical, but that the Greek people were to be sacrificed in the name of greater political and economic showmanship. In darker news, the ever-expanding scope of this process has led us to the very brink of climate disaster. Yet, we have refused at every turn to pull back. The actual threat of total ecological collapse is secondary to the maintenance of the market as a whole. The movie Don't Look Up is such a blatant scream about this issue that half the commentary about the movie is just how much it lacks even the slightest bit of subtlety. Heavy-handed, self-indulgent, we've already heard it all before. But to even make a critique like Don't Look Up means making a commodity. Full stop. For a message to be heard by anyone today, it must in some way make itself profitable and to be distributed to a wide audience. Everyone who made it needs to be paid, it needs to be marketed, investors need to expect a return, etc. this late in the game, the realism is so totalizing that even critiques against it can be consumed by its ethos. I mean, dude, they sell anarchist t-shirts. Like, we may espouse the importance of democratic processes. We may discuss the importance of preserving the ecosystem. We may claim that it is the flourishing of human freedom and life which drives these decisions at the core of the ethos. But when push comes to shove, at the end of the day, we choose again and again market forces and profitability over any of the things housed under their umbrella.
Edward Wolf is a professor of economics at New York University.
Today, the average family has enough financial reserves to keep it going for about 3 weeks. That's it. And that's middle income. And if you go further down the ladder, basically the financial reserves can keep the family going for a couple of days at most. And so, you know, these financial reserves have just completely evaporated. It's incredible.
Figures from the Institute of International Finance show global debt has reached over $250 trillion. Paying that amount off by $1 each second would still take more than 7 million years. The 1970s brought the liberalization and deregulation of the world's financial system. This led to the abundance of cheap credit, leading to unsustainable borrowing levels, contributing to the financial crash of 2008. If we continue with today's economic practices, economists say we are inviting a recession even worse than the previous one.
What we see now is, disposable income is much lower. People's ability to withstand shocks is much thinner. Citizens Advice have reported that 40% of people that they see have no disposable income. They've had any shocks to their income, relationship breakdown, and the universal credit problem has left people, a large proportion of people struggling.
Even though productivity rose by a little over 72% from 1973 to 2014, so 41 years, median hourly compensation only went up by just under 9%. In other words, workers had to produce $8 extra of value just to earn $1 extra in wages. But after the year 1973, things changed dramatically, and you can see that the compensation line not only stops going up, but actually decreases from 73 until the late 90s. The Economic Policy Institute also found that CEO pay went up by almost 1,000% over a similar period of time. In 1965, the average CEO made 20 times as much as their average worker, but when this study was released in 2019, that gap had increased to 278 CEO dollars for every one worker dollar.
Corporations are reporting record profits as companies pass rising supply chain costs on to consumers.
Over the past year, companies' net margins have risen to record highs, and net margins are expected to rise again over the next year.
Wall Street Journal reporter Dion Rabowen.
Nearly 100 of the biggest U.S. publicly traded companies booked 2021 profit margins that were at least 50% higher than their 2019 levels.
While many issues, including obesity, have contributed to this decrease, a large portion of it has been attributed to deaths of despair. These deaths are associated with states of substantially increased psychological stress and result from alcoholism, drug overdoses, and suicides. In 2017, overdose deaths hit a new record in the United States at around 72,000, becoming the leading cause of death for Americans under 55. In 2018, close to 47,000 overdose deaths were opioid-related, with 2/3 of them involving synthetic opioids. One of the most prominent suggestions is that in places hit hardest by the epidemic, distress over deteriorating economic conditions, coupled with inadequate formal and informal safety nets, may shoulder much of the blame. According to the Brookings Institution, deaths of despair are highest in places where blue-collar jobs like manufacturing are disappearing. Between 1997 and 2003, approximately 1.5 million rural workers lost their jobs. Job loss is associated with severe stress for both the individual and their families, impacting economic security, self-esteem, physical health, marital and parental discord, and likelihood to abuse alcohol and other substances.
The cyclists pushed OxyContin to everyday people who had little use for the drug.
They corrupted the entire supply chain, employing armies of sales reps, paying off doctors, lobbying for favorable regulation, and making billions while masses fell into devastating addiction.
To maximize profits, American hospitals have been intentionally understaffing nurses for decades, long before the pandemic.
The Age of Fire must continue, no matter the sacrifice. The logic of the system in place requires ever more illogical and insane acts to maintain itself. This is that totalizing authoritarian nature of instrumental rationality I was talking about before. But rather than being instantiated in an individual, it's embedded in the world as a whole. We worked out the equation to utopia long ago. We merely need to keep playing it out. Anything that questions this ultimate goal is, by definition, a mistake or evil.
In reality, Americans aspire to wealth, whether you're at the bottom of the ladder or at the top of the ladder, and confiscating gains makes absolutely no sense. It's totally the antithesis of what America was built on.
In the wake of 2 world wars, Adorno and Horkheimer asked, how was it that the Enlightenment had gone so wrong? How was it that with all of our great tools of science and reason, we had found ourselves on the largest stage of butchery and inhumanity in historical record? If reason was meant to be our emancipation from the myth, how do you explain Nazi Germany and the like? Now, in their estimation, this faculty for reason had a natural totalizing tendency. There it is again. It had this tendency to raise itself and its vision above whatever object it was taking up, and because of this, it was inherently subject to collapse. Reason can't free us from myth because it is itself merely another myth. Or to connect it to Neumann's points and Jungian psychology generally, any myth traces the contours of the human psyche. It is an image of ourselves. Any product of our minds will inevitably bear the shape of the hand that crafted it. No matter how fully we feel we have grasped the thing, we will tend always to raise our model dogmatically to a kind of unquestioning godhood, to become blind to whatever it is outside our conception. Like any religious faith, the Enlightenment guides a kind of correct human behavior. Rather than being prescribed from above, it believes that through reason we can arrive at this perfect system of human organization. Utopia, if you will. The kingdom of heaven, if you'd prefer. But once you have the idea that there is a perfect way to human, any deviation from this behavior must be wrong, if not outright evil, because it actively slows or oppresses the ultimate eternal good. The other side of reason is its nature as a model builder and categorizer, because it must envision the world, it must always simplify and other it. It has to choose to privilege certain elements about it as essential and important while relegating the rest to neutrality or irrelevance based on the ends it has prescribed itself. The world is seen as separate and subject to its manipulations and understandings, just as a matter of course. So efficiency may be reasonable. Pursuing material benefits may be reasonable, etc., etc. But with this dynamic in mind, you can come to understand why a lot of people hold the tenets of free market operation with a nearly religious fervor. because it very much is that. It's the scripture and testament to the founding myth that maintains their worldview. And like we discussed earlier, the myth is the bones of our collective human world. It's a part of us. It comprises how we understand our own soul. Whatever cannot be given a calculable and measurable value is thus illusion, merely poetry. In their discussion about the culture industry, Adorno and Horkheimer point directly to the process by which this expansion takes over the means by which we understand and communicate with each other. The demands of profit subsume communication. Seeking to build mass audiences means keeping the lowest common denominator concepts and shaping ideas to be sold. The for-profit 24-hour news stations like your Fox and your CNNs show just how far this same process has progressed since the time that they wrote this book. What matters isn't information or being informed. What matters is ratings. So playing to the expectations and the basic emotions of your audience means you survive as an organization. Circumscribe the topics of debate, inform to your audience's curated expectations, and use the profits to maintain the dynamic in perpetuity. There you go, successful news corporation for the rest of time. Recently, Facebook openly admitted that it knew about plans to storm the Capitol during the riots, but chose not to get involved. They also admitted that they gave a greater algorithmic weight to reactions like anger as opposed to just a basic like, because they drove engagement and more clicks. This process is true across the internet, pushing highly emotional topics and controversy into people's feeds as a rule because it keeps them glued to their screen longer. They see more advertisements. It's better for business. And if ever in your own life you've ever thought of spending time on a hobby like painting or writing, but felt compelled to make it profitable, then you know this. You know that it has penetrated your own existence. Our days are regimented around a broad swinging workday. People maximize the efficiency of their workout time because they need to stay healthy enough to maintain the 1,000 small things that they have to get done to stay above water. You can't exercise simply because it's good to do so or it's enjoyable. Every aspect of our lives slowly becomes directly commodified or has to shape itself in the service to the demands of the societal music as a whole. You can't just be a painter. You have to find a way to sell it. If you're into felting, you better start an Etsy. If you're into cooking, you better find a way to market it to your friends. Our deepest nature is merely another resource to be cultivated and sold. That's a lot. I may have overdone the Pringles thing. But much as Arendt did, Adorno and Horkheimer point out the circular quality of our attempts to escape the rule of nature, ultimately creating a tyrant. In the end, our most human elements become just another resource. Your nature is sacrificed to the overall totalizing perspective. But as it, by design, has done away with and established itself as above the transcendent, its greatest good can only be conceived of as its own continuation. Therefore, everything must serve the continuation of the cycle. We use our souls as kindling in the name of a vision staked out in defiance of the nature that birthed it. But with all of this, I'm trying to stake out the all-pervasive nature of this myth. the way that it's permeated every element of our life simultaneously, to illuminate a little bit some of the qualities that it has. Gwyn, Lord of Light, the one who enlightens, established a structure and ordered world full of incredible, wondrous things. But while triumphant in many ways, it's not perfect. While powerful and enduring, it's not eternal. It has a shelf life. At every stage, Gwyn fought every threat to his vision. He destroyed the dragons, warred with the demons, enslaved humanity through trickery. Ultimately, he gave into fear, doing whatever it took to keep things as they were. In the end, he defied the natural course of things and prolonged the Age of Fire through his own self-immolation. The dream itself was sacrificed to fuel and maintain the systems the dream created. But this sacrifice only really locked the age that came after into repeating the same act with greater cost and less benefit every time. It stretched the world thin, slowly crushing everyone who lives within it. But the people who live within it can't conceive of a world outside of that order. It's totalizing. It is the only thing they've known and have been told, the only thing they're able to imagine. To secure the future of this system, Gwyn bound the dark in a ring of fire, preventing it from spreading beyond its predetermined bounds. And now, those who took up his post after his death depend on more and more elaborate deceits and dominations to channel that very humanity into the kiln as kindling. But the preservation of the age has been defined as the greatest possible good. You're saving the world. Everything must serve that need, no matter the cost. But by containing the chaotic humanity that he feared so much, Gwyn doomed his kingdom to a stagnation and an ever-growing oppression to keep that same wild humanity locked up. And worse, as we know, the dark, when tortured, doesn't sit still. It becomes a bed of rage and hatred and pain that consumes everything it has a chance to touch. In Dark Souls 1, you find the Hollows shambling, or still. Occasionally they lash out at you, but by Dark Souls 3, you begin to see some Hollows erupting into this pitch black monster. A monster best dealt with by fire, as it turns out. The kids are not all right. The status is not quo. The circle cannot hold. Pick your metaphor. As I stated before and numerous times, the brilliance of this text is how well it communicates all of this phenomenologically. You experience the slow collapse of the world, the failures of the current myth to maintain itself. You watch how people struggle endlessly to believe despite all the evidence to the contrary. Or that simply give up, collapsing, or become psychotic. This takes place through small changes, the environment, or your own interactions. Your first playthrough, you probably don't realize that Honor Londo's son was an illusion. We accept the world as presented. We accept the undead curse as it's explained, because the first time you hear Frampt lay out your quest, it fits your expectations well enough for you to swallow it. But the more you look and watch and suffer, the more and more clear it becomes. And by going about things differently, by walking off the garden path, it's thrown in your face just how much you've been deceived, how much a tool you've been in the designs made by others, designs you couldn't really imagine when you first showed up here. I mean, your currency is souls. Like, it's a little on the nose, right? Dark Souls is the projected dream of living in the endlessly dying age of enlightenment, experiences this brutal, ultimately pointless struggle, divorced from ourselves, banished from our history, and pawned to events so far in the past that no one living can rightly remember truth from legend. Right? Dope. We did it. Cool story. Wrap it up. But what does this have to do with depression? You thought I forgot, didn't you? You probably forgot this video was about depression too. Turns out, it's all connected. Everything affects everything. The universe is a fractal. Time is a self-interpreting disco ball. But the connection is what it was at the beginning. Our experience, our psyche, can't be separated from its culture or environment or any of its outsides, really, any more than the body can be separated from the heart and the brain and the stomach and still really be a body. The borders of the psyche aren't physical or temporal. They're perceptual and experiential. If you change the instruments or the notes, then you have changed the music. There is no difference, only emergence. How can a person not be depressed? How can a person not be divorced from the locus of their values when everything around them is built to turn that into fuel for someone else's gain?
Once the Lord of Light banished dark and all that stemmed from humanity. And men assumed a fleeting form. These are the roots of our world. Men are props in the stage of life, and no matter how tender, how exquisite, a lie will remain a lie.
Rollo May was an existential psychologist who ran amok in the mid-20th century. He wrote quite a few books, and they're pretty good. You should check them out. But one of the things he was grappling with throughout was he saw this kind of sickness of the age, if you will. He noted early in his career that the proportion of certain psychological problems that clinicians are seeing had changed. Many of the issues that folks like Freud had seen all the time were now rare or absent entirely. And many disorders that had been footnotes back then had suddenly exploded in popularity. Now, in his case, the main issue was anxiety, but, for our purposes, what matters here is the principle behind his thought. As he saw it, the greater cultural soup had a character, and that character affected the people within it. It encouraged certain things, it prohibited others, it afforded certain opportunities and denied others, etc. This put certain pressures and pulls onto the people living within it. Where you live shaped you. But, while people can certainly be shaped, they're not infinitely malleable. You can only stretch a person so far, and depending on the society and the person in question, some portion of the population would suffer that process more acutely. Now, humanity as a whole is made of a wide variety of people. And while we have a lot in common with each other, we're all kind of unique at our edges. Some people react very strongly to a bad situation. Other people hardly feel it at all. Some people are highly social, others less so. And it's often at the edges of people that you really start to notice things, particularly on large scales. Now, May's thought was that this rise in certain flavors of neuroses was due to the nature of the society at large and how it affected the people that made it up. This was most apparent at certain edges because certain people were naturally going to be more sensitive to these forces and less equipped to cope with them. So naturally, they would react more strongly. A tall person is going to pass out before a shorter person when the G-forces get wild. It's not a flaw, it's just physics. But it's worth remembering that this pressed on everyone always, not just those at the margins. To his mind, by seeing the ways that people were seeking help in large numbers, you could better understand where a society was broken, or toxic, or insufficient. Inhuman, if you will. Across his oeuvre, he commented on how more and more of his patients reported a sense of emptiness inside, a disconnection from the being that made it impossible for them to even begin living fulfilling lives. Any more than you could decide what to eat if you had no ability to taste. And he classed this as a monumental first-order problem, not only for his patients, but for everyone alive at the time. We inherited from our Victorian forefathers the belief that the only real problem in life was to decide rationally what to do, and then will would stand ready as the faculty for making us do it. Now, it is no longer a matter of deciding what to do, but deciding how to decide. The very basis for will itself is thrown into question. This deep separation and inability to decide, even how to decide, meant we had trouble experiencing real love, real joy, real success, even real anger or sorrow, because those things require our full selves to engage with them. We had no clue what that was. This left us in a state of existential anxiety, which, as existentialists like Kierkegaard point out, is much more than simply being nervous. It's more kind of spiritual crucifixion, dangling a person painfully above the ground while simultaneously denying them the freedom of flight. One of the outcomes of this anxiety was that it cut a person off from the source of power and experience. In short, it was our ability to choose certain goals and to pursue those goals by standards internal to ourselves that redeemed existence, what gave us nobility and our greatest expression as people. To lose that meant to fall into a state where we could, at best, grasp at basic needs like food, distraction, sleep, all while slowly starving to death at our center. Which, fair point, all around, dead dudes. I think anyone who's spent hours just doom scrolling through Instagram and then binging on junk food they barely notice to watch whatever shows on Netflix this week before going to bed, then wondering about what the hell their life is about, knows this exactly. I don't need to explain that. You feel it in your stomach. Now, personally, I think there's a pretty strong relationship between depression and anxiety, and I'm not alone with that. I'm definitely not unique in that idea. There's lots of psychologists who see them as two sides to a larger process. To my mind, this process is tied to something like learned helplessness, going numb rather than feeling a pain that you can't change or affect. Basically, it's a toll that leaves you exhausted at the very center of you. It's a kind of spiritual resignation. But that's another topic. If this whole framework of separating a person from their natural locus of desire is correct, if it's got any accuracy, then it's to be expected that people would be depressed in massive numbers because the parts of their psyche that they share with everyone is itself deeply depressed. We've cut people off from their inner life at every possible level, given them no outlets, only the simplest kinds of satisfactions, and even those are precarious for a lot of people. We've convinced them that this is the only way it could possibly be, and force them to warp every good and life-sustaining part of themselves into a mere means of perpetuating the game for another cycle. We made Kant sad, y'all, because we're intimately joined with our surroundings, dreaming it into being and being dreamed by it in turn. We suffer when we destroy our connection to our unconscious, losing our life force and driving those same forces to possess and assault us anytime we're not looking. The world around us is just the crystallized collective dream of humanity, and it's part of those same dynamics. The land of Dark Souls is the land, and a metaphor, and the psychic landscape, and a distilled myth, all at once, because that's how the world has always been. That's how the actual world works. It's turtles, all the way down. So, great. Depression is a complex global state of the deepest alienation, so fully encompassing a person as to require religious metaphor to properly capture. And our world is a prison slowly consuming us in itself in an endless downward loop. Sick. So what can you do about it? Part the fourth. What can you do about it?
Take a moment to imagine a bright blue sky stretching off into the distance. It feels pretty good, right? Ready to just gently close the eyes.
Managing anxiety, letting go of stress, putting down our phones. So there's a meditation about putting down your phone, which is available on your phone.
Okay, so maybe there are just a few clouds.
Look, I don't know how it is that we fix this. That's the straight answer. This is a textual analysis. It's not therapy or a manifesto. I don't think we're going to solve the human condition here and a go. And if you've played enough Dark Souls or watched enough videos discussing what, if any, ending is the best canonical ending to the game, you'll probably walk away thinking that Dark Souls doesn't really have a straight answer either. And in a certain sense, you're right. I don't think Dark Souls gives you a definitive answer to the question of its own resolution, at least not in the narrative. Instead, what I think Dark Souls gives you is a tangible experience. I've said it before, we're in the realm of phenomenology here. What matters most isn't what you're told or what you read or see, but the things that you experience in the game. I think that is Dark Souls' answer. In The Discovery of Being, Rollo May expands a bit on Kierkegaard's idea of the leap of faith. A second-order contribution of Kierkegaard to dynamic psychology lies in his emphasis upon the necessity of commitment. This follows from the points already made above. Truth becomes reality only as the individual produces it in action, which includes producing it in his own consciousness. Kierkegaard's point has the radical implication that we cannot even see a particular truth unless we already have some commitment to it. Now, this is obviously a huge topic, but the fun-sized version is this. No amount of mere reasoning can be taken as either understanding or as real truth. Understanding requires your whole being. You can only truly know what you've thought and performed. To give you a really small example, you can read every book about riding bikes and you can watch people riding them and you can draw diagrams of them, but until you've actually ridden the bike, you don't actually understand it. Truth exists only in bridging that internal representation with wider reality. Moreover, there are certain things you just can't understand until you've already begun doing them. You don't know how to be in a relationship until you've already been in a relationship for some time. At a certain point, you just have to do and accept that as your real instruction. More poetically, maybe we could say that understanding only comes after embracing the transcendent side of existence, in recognizing that it is fundamentally beyond us to put it in a box that we can carry around. To realize that while immortality is impossible, eternity is tangible and graspable to us moment to moment every day. To exist is a doing, so go do to better be is the takeaway I guess. Throughout this game, you meet a wild menagerie of characters and creatures, and honestly, one of the most compelling to me is Seath the Scaleless, who's this ancient dragon who was born without scales, obviously, which turn out to be the thing that make the original dragons eternal. And so he betrays his people to Gwyn and ultimately goes on this quest to try to make the thing that he was born without, and spends the rest of his very long life failing to do this thing. And over the course of it, you watch how Seath and all of the sorcerers who kind of follow in his footsteps just go mad trying to kind of understand the totality of existence in this regimented intellectual way. But, you know, the flip side of that, the faith side, you know, dogma ultimately led to bondage and despair in organizations like the Way of White and the Kingdom of Lothric. Characters like Gwyn, who had this sort of just general vision of self that they sought to expand into larger constructs, you know, they collapse upon themselves in fear and paranoia. Others, you know, give in to guilt and shame. Some just become nihilists and give up entirely. But it's you, the player, who gets up over and over and over again to explore the world, to uncover its secrets and to meet its inhabitants, and you fight the same monsters over and over and over again. But that itself is the key. What you felt, the frustration and the anxiety and the elation and the brief moments of joy when your favorite NPC shows up unexpectedly, those feelings are the answer Dark Souls gives to this problem. When you're experiencing those things, when you're doing those things, you don't feel the emptiness. You don't feel the meaninglessness of it. You feel the solution through doing it. When you get to the end of the Dark Souls games and you link the fire or have all of your answers, what you want mostly in that moment is to go back, to revisit these battles and these conversations and these bits of exploration that you had, to recapture all of the things you were trying so hard to get through quickly before. Carl Jung's Liber Novus is a pretty challenging book to interpret. I think you can see a lot of his career afterwards as an attempt to do just that, actually. But, you know, in short, sitting at the brink of World War I, being possessed by apocalyptic visions and half convinced he was losing his own sanity, my boy CG explored the depths of his experience and looked to this mythic record of humanity, and he came back with some interpretations. The part I'm going to highlight here is his discussion about the concept of hell, specifically descents into it, because honestly, a lot of the really compelling and powerful myths that have kind of endured in our collective heritage revolve around just this sort of event, the descent into the underworld, right? The meeting of the dead, the confrontation of dark chthonic forces, and most importantly, the times when somebody actually comes back from this. Hell isn't just a story to frighten children with. I mean, it is that. You should use it to frighten children. But it's also, psychologically speaking, our birthright. The descent into hell is the experience of finding your own limits as a being, and the painful process of learning to encompass something that was heretofore outside of yourself. It also captures the experience of what it's like to break against the rocks in the attempt. In Jung's words, hell is when the depths come to you with all that you no longer are or are not yet capable of. Hell is when you can no longer attain what you could attain. Hell is when you must think and feel and do everything that you do not want. That everything high is also low, that everything pleasant is also shameful. So in sort of examining the Christ myth and his descent into hell as a psychological metaphor of the individual, right? You know, the conclusion he reached is that that descent, that part of the story was necessary, that the task set to that character was the same task that had always been set to everyone, to do and to be, even though we're in circumstances where we had never done or been before. The call to marshal our inner forces and to befriend these dark demons of the self and to use that courage to walk into the unknown. He basically concludes that we descend into hell not to rescue the dead, but to take up their legacy, to find the shades of the things we have discarded and have lost and buried, and to bring them back to us. It's our birthright because unmaking is also a part of the thing that we are. A few years back, the Library of Congress made a display of Jung's Red Book, and I'm the kind of nerd who actually went and listened to all of the keynote speaks and whatnot. And one of the openers was a scholar named, and I'm really sorry, I'm definitely going to get this wrong. It was Sonu Shamdasani. Anyway, Sonu had this to say about the imagery and the interpretation of one's descent into the underworld. This means taking back into the human interior not just his own lowest, his inferior part, but also his force that creates the gods. Not just his shadows, but also his now redeemed feeling, the treasure of warm human love, the fundamental elements of reality. For example, Jung must embrace the serpent of God who wants human blood. The serpent is the earthly essence of man which is not conscious. The devil, who is the sum of darkness of human nature, now has no power over him. For Satan is the quintessence of pure evil, pure negation without force. Taking on the serpent, Jung fetters the devil and builds a firm structure that can withstand the fluctuations of the personal. And therefore, the immortal within me is saved. When I play Dark Souls, I always find that I look forward most to the DLC when I can go back to Oolacile. Now, some of this undoubtedly is just my love of fairy tales, and the fight with Artorias and Calamite always put me through my paces in different ways. You get a mushroom friend, and there's a steampunk betrayal. It's just good stuff all around. But what I really love probably most in Oolacile is having conversations with a character named Hawkeye Go. So narratively, when you go to Oolacile, you're actually going back in time about 300 years. So this takes place sometime after Gwyn has gone to Link the Fire, but before the Age of Legends is really done. So it's kind of the closest you get to seeing the Age of Fire in full swing. Now, previously, in its heyday, Hawkeye Go was the leader of the Dragon Slayer Knights. He was one of the 4 main knights of Gwyn. Now, each of these characters is a legendary hero from this ancient wartime. But when we meet him, Go is imprisoned under some pretty terrible circumstances. He's locked in a tower above the monstrous remains of one of his oldest friends, and he's been blinded by his captors as a kind of cruel joke. He spends his days now practicing wood carving alone in this prison tower. But despite the objective awfulness of his circumstances, the fact that he's lost all of his friends and that the age he grew up in is ending, Go has this sense of peace with the flow of life that's hard to place in the canon of Dark Souls as a whole. He's kind of a standout character. He'll thank you for killing Artorias and leaving his honor intact, and he'll offer to help you take down the big black dragon, which definitely messed up your day at least once up to this point. But it's his reminiscing that really gets the point of his character across, I think. What gave Go the kind of life and understanding that made him both the legendary hero that he was in the past and this sage, Zen-like character practicing his art form now is the kind of life he led and the sorts of experiences that he's incorporated into himself.
A visitor, have we? Thou must be the one who freed Artorias. An old friend he was. Thanks to thee, he left this world with honor intact. And here I am, retired and blind. Of little help to thee, I'm afraid. Even if this land shall expire, thou may be able to prevent further corrosion. But even so, one day the flames will fade, and only dark will remain, and even a legend such as thyself can do nothing to stop that. Now, do not mistake my words. I cherish my work. Wood carving is a nuanced art. I would have much to talk about with that blacksmith. Dragons shall never be forgotten. We knights fought valiantly, but for every one of them, we lost 70 of our own. Exhilaration, pride, hatred, rage. The dragons teased out our dearest emotions. Thou will understand one day. At thy twilight, old thoughts return in great waves of nostalgia.
Which is the whole thing in a nutshell. Go had struggled and met all of the forces inside himself, and he had gone forth outside of himself and confronted. He'd connected the inner and outer and had seen the totality of his experience and accepted it. You know, through this process, he found real comrades and potent experience, and he'd finally met himself completely. And against this, the vicissitudes of his current fate are just the next thing that happened. So as I'm reading this, I do want to stress that I'm not saying that the answer is this kind of like stoic acceptance of whatever happens. You know, no matter how bad your circumstances, it's kind of the opposite, actually. What I got from Go was actually more kind of like the idea that like a person who knows the Tao in the morning can die in the evening having lived a full life. You know, Go, more than anyone in the story, is able to stare down the ending of his age without fear because he kind of lived it fully. He fought his fight to the very edge of his abilities, and he's okay with something new taking his place. God is dead, sure, but the world is still turning, so why would you despair? Depression is paralyzing. It's all consuming. It's yourself turned desperately upon yourself without end. But there's something in the act of doing, of actively existing, of knowing that you're small and fragile and choosing to seek adversity anyway. There's something in that experience that you start to lose what makes depression so debilitating. The circumstances don't change, but something in you does. And it's slow and it's winding, but it does have a trajectory that you can feel when you're about it. So I think we do have to accept that we're conditioned by our world. It's equally true that that world is conditioned by us. It's two poles of the same dream, and like Arendt says, it's action that changes it just as much as its momentum changes us. Finding the novel chaos and giving it truth through actualizing it in the world is the only choice we've ever really had. It was only ever an illusion that it had been something else. We don't get to dictate circumstances any more than we get to hold a moment fixed in time because we love it. In the end, existence, whatever you mean by that, is this current that you don't get to fight, but you do get to choose how you move through the current. You get to choose how to be. And by choosing to be fully and authentically, and by learning to kind of engage with this dance, you get to find something that makes it all worth the price of admission. When I was buried in the chaos of my own life and mind, I always began to feel this pull to make a run through Dark Souls. It was actually consistent enough that sometimes if I felt drawn to Dark Souls, it was enough to tip me off that maybe something wasn't quite right internally at the time. And honestly, on a surface level, it felt really strange that I didn't choose something like Animal Crossing or Tetris, or even just a game with a happy ending. Instead, again and again, I would choose this enigmatic and dark fantasy, which is famous for just beating its players into the ground until they got good or gave up. And it was strange that I felt compelled to pull up all of its floorboards and to find its secrets and its hidden meanings. You know, that doesn't sound like catharsis. It sounds like work and sadness, actually. But time and again, when I came up to the end of one of the games and I watched the Age of Fire begin anew, or I ushered in an Age of Dark, or became the Lord of Hollows that one time, if I was being a monster. Seriously, I don't know how anybody can choose that ending. Doing that to Henri is so hard on me emotionally. But there at the end, what I felt a lot was sadness that it was over. But I also felt like it was manageable. Things were manageable. Not good, usually. The darkness was still there, but it felt like something I could sink my teeth into and walk through. If you play through the DLCs of the third game, you'll eventually find yourself returning from the ends of time, carrying the blood of Slave Knight Gale, who has now spent an endless, undying life hunting and consuming the carriers of the Dark Soul until it's literally permeated his blood. He did this knowing that it was the last thing he would do, and he sent you here. He left breadcrumbs to bring you to this point, this confrontation, because he knew that when it came down to the last bit, he wouldn't be able to pull it off. When you get back, you bring this distilled essence of humanity, and you give it to a young painter girl. And alone in another dying world, she thanks you for bringing her the pigment and begins to paint a new world out of everything that humanity had been up to that point. And that's the thing, right? Good and bad, all of it. That's what it takes to paint a new world. And just because something has ended doesn't mean that it's not the beginning of something else.
Those who aren't akin to fire cannot paint a world. Those absorbed by fire must not paint the world. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten, Mother. My thanks, Ashen One. With this will I paint a world. Please tell me thy name. I will name this painting after thee. I will paint a world of that name. 'Twill be a cold, dark, and very gentle place. And one day, it will make someone a goodly home. I wonder when Uncle Gale intends his return. I hope the new painting will be to him a gentle home.
Dark Souls offers this small crack in our experience without really ever letting us know that it's there. You know, there's that famous line, the crack is where the light comes through. And so Dark Souls pushes a kind of truth into your bones before you really have a chance to deny it with your thoughts. It's hard to deny the feeling you're having while you're having it. And Dark Souls shows you exactly where you've been all along and proves to you, through you, that you never really needed to be anywhere else at all. To quote the man himself, the mind is its own place and in itself can make heaven of hell, hell of heaven. So, praise the sun. Go forth, seek adversity and jolly cooperation wherever you have the opportunity. If you need to, harrow hell and let death feel thy sting. And whatever you do, don't you dare go hollow. Hey, it's me editing. This is my editing self. I actually just finished putting together all of the last of the stuff and getting ready to finalize this piece. So if you made it this far, genuinely, thank you. I realized that what I put together was the most rambly feature-length film that I could have possibly designed. So if you've actually pushed through to this point, I really do appreciate it. I hope you found something interesting there. You know, I started making this thing ages ago, writing and revising and all of that. And now I've been poring over it in intimate detail, staring at my own face and listening to my own voice for just what feels like an eternity. That's a nightmare. Do not recommend. But, you know, as I was going, my main question was something like, you know, did I do what I wanted? The sad answer to that is no, I did not. Moving forward, I think I need to take to heart a lot of lessons I learned through this process. But funnily enough, you know, when I started making this and kind of periodically throughout, as you may have picked up on the video, I had my own battles with depression and weirdly having this sort of long running project, messy as it was really helpful for that. It felt good to make something, even if it was a bit diffuse. And it was a really interesting experience, I think, to be making this thing about Dark Souls and the experience of pushing through as if there was another side while doing that, like in my own life. Anyway, I just thought it was kind of an interesting, cool resonance, proof of concept. If the video essay is a boss, I defeated it by cheesing it, I think. Moving forward, I'm really going to focus on smaller, more concise pieces that don't require my every faculty to be cranked up to 11 to pull off. Definitely tighten up the writing, work on that editing, all that good stuff. But I am genuinely excited for that at this point. So thank you again if you made it this far. If you liked it, let me know. Say something. Or, I don't know, buy a billboard somewhere. I'm sure I'll run into it. If you hated it, also let me know with lots and lots of detail, please. We'll either take it to heart or I'll ignore it, and you'll never know which one it is. If you want to give me money, that is currently impossible. I don't have any means of doing that. So my recommendation is just put it in a small wooden container, bury it in your backyard or under the nearest tree, and it will make its way to me. If you really want to support me, please send music. I can never find new music on my own, so that would be great. Movie recommendations. I'm always looking for stuff I've genuinely never seen before. Really been into A24 lately. So whatever strange film you've got in your belt, I want that. Best of all, honestly, if you really enjoyed something here, you found something meaningful, go out and make something cool or do something cool and then tell me about that. I think probably the best outcome of a video about handling depression through abundant life and creativity would be if people then went out and lived or created things. That would be pretty cool. I also want to say thank you to just the entire YouTube community for all of the shots of content. I tried to make sure everybody got tagged as best I could. If I missed one, I'm sorry. All of the footage that I shot of my own stuff was awful, totally unusable. So thank all of you for putting everything up online. Anyway, thank you again for pushing through. It really means a lot to me to be able to put anything out online and have people experience it. I've got a couple of ideas for stuff to do in the future that's a little less dense. Hopefully, man, no promises. I will try to make it more concise and to the point and better structured, and with less cheesy endings. Ooh. But I guess if Griffith taught us anything, it's that the path to victory is paved with mistakes. Anyway, that's enough rambling on my part. I really just wanted to say thank you for making it this far and for everyone and everything that allowed me to put it together. It was an enormous project, but a weirdly fulfilling one. So thank you.